Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight, before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Think about that quietly. Let the question settle, and when you're ready, allow yourself to drift into the story. The fluorescent lights in the basement of the municipal building cast their pale glow across rows of metal, filing cabinets that stretched into shadows. Detective Sarah Chun had grown accustomed to the hum of the ventilation system, a constant white noise that seemed to breathe with the building itself. It was past midnight when she found herself here again, drawn not by any urgent case, but by the peculiar comfort these archives provided. The smell of old paper and metal hung in the air like incense in an abandoned chapel. Each cabinet contained decades of carefully cataloged human stories, reduced to report numbers and evidence tags. The fluorescent bulb above her workspace flickered occasionally, casting brief shadows that danced across the yellowed pages. Spread before her, she had come here initially to retrieve a file for a cold case review. But something about the stillness of this place kept her lingering. The building above her had emptied hours ago, leaving only the night security guard making his rounds and the distant sound of occasional traffic filtering through the thick basement walls. File 1987 to 4429 lay open before her, its contents spilling across the metal desk in careful chronology. The case involved a series of break-ins that had occurred over 3 months in the Riverside district. Nothing spectacular, nothing that would make headlines or inspire television dramas. Just the methodical documentation of someone systematically entering homes while families slept, taking nothing more valuable than costume jewelry and small electronics. The responding officers had documented everything with the same careful precision that characterized thousands of similar files in these cabinets. Officer Martinez had noted the point of entry in each case, the time of discovery, the list of missing items written in his careful block letters. Detective Thompson had followed up with neighborhood canvassing reports, witness statements that led nowhere, fingerprint analyses that yielded no matches. What struck Chun as she read through the file was not the crime itself, but the patience embedded in its documentation. Each report represented hours of methodical work, conversations with frightened homeowners, careful examination of jimmied window frames and disturbed belongings. The perpetrator was never caught, but the case lived on in these pages, preserved with the same care given to solved murders and federal investigations. She closed the file and walked deeper into the archive, her footsteps echoing softly against the concrete floor. The cabinets were arranged by year and case type, creating pathways through decades of human transgression and police response. She passed 1985, 1986, 1987, each year containing its own catalog of forgotten URGENCIES. In the section marked 1983-1984, she pulled a drawer that hadn't been opened in months. The metal runners squeaked gently as dozens of manila folders revealed themselves, each one tagged with a small white label bearing a case number and brief description. Her fingers traced over the tabs as she read. Vandalism, City Park. Theft, residential. Public intoxication, downtown. Missing person resolved. The missing person file caught her attention, and she lifted it from its place among the others. Case 1984 to 2156 concerned a teenage girl named Maria Santos who had disappeared for 4 days in October of that year. The file contained the initial missing person report filled out by her mother, Rosa Santos, in Spanish and English, with the desk sergeant's careful translations noted in the margins. Maria had left for school on a Tuesday morning and simply never arrived. Her friends hadn't seen her. Her teachers marked her absent. By Thursday, her mother had called the police. Though the report noted that Mrs. Santos had waited because Maria had stayed out late before and often spent nights at friends' houses without calling, the Colbadida Investigation that followed was thorough but brief. Officers canvassed the route between the Santos home and Lincoln High School. They spoke with teachers, friends, and family members. They checked local hospitals and contacted police departments in neighboring cities. The reports painted a picture of a quiet, reliable student who occasionally rebelled against her mother's strict curfew but had never disappeared for more than a single night. On Sunday morning, Maria Santos walked into the police station on her own. The report of her return was shorter than those documenting her disappearance. She told Detective Williams that she had gone to stay with an aunt in Sacramento, though the aunt had not been contacted during the search and claimed not to have seen Maria. The girl provided no further explanation, and her mother, perhaps relieved to have her daughter back, pressed no charges and asked no questions that made it into the official record. The case was marked resolved and filed away. But reading it now, decades later, Chun found herself wondering about the 4 days that had never been accounted for. Where had Maria Santos actually been? What had prompted her to disappear, and why had she returned? The questions hung in the air of the archive like dust motes in the fluorescent light. Neither demanding nor expecting answers, she returned the file to its place and continued her slow journey through the cabinets. The basement seemed to expand around her as she walked, creating space for contemplation in its maze of records. Each drawer she passed represented countless hours of police work, the routine labor of maintaining social order through careful documentation. Case 1985 to 3377 detailed a series of noise complaints against an apartment complex on Elm Street. For 6 months, residents of the Parkview Arms had called police about loud music, shouting, and parties that stretched into the early morning hours. Officer Patricia Reeves had responded to most of these calls, documenting each one with the same measured professionalism. Reports revealed a pattern of escalating frustration among the buildings. Residents, Mrs. Chun and Thria, had called 12 times. Between March and August, Mr. Davidson in 2C had made 7 complaints, each one growing more detailed in its description of the disturbances. The building's property manager had been contacted repeatedly but claimed his hands were tied by lease agreements and tenant rights. Officer Reeves had spoken with the residents of 3B, the apparent source of the noise, on 17 separate occasions. The apartment was shared by 4 college students attending the nearby university. They were consistently polite during these encounters, always agreeing to lower their music and keep their voices down. But the complaints continued with reliable frequency. The case files contained no dramatic resolution. The students moved out at the end of their lease in August, and the complaints stopped. The matter was marked closed, filed away with dozens of similar conflicts that had resolved themselves through the simple passage of time and changing circumstances. Chun found herself drawn to these mundane cases, these small conflicts that never made it beyond the neighborhood level. They represented the vast majority of police work, the daily maintenance of community peace that rarely generated headlines or commendations. But they were documented with the same care as major felonies. Each report signed and dated and filed in its proper place. The archive clock showed 1:30 a.m. as she settled into reading Case 1986 to 1492. A shoplifting incident at Myers Department Store. The suspect, a woman in her 50s named Dorothy Walsh, had been observed concealing a scarf and small bottle of perfume in her purse. Store security had detained her at the exit, and police had been called to complete the arrest. Officer Kim's report noted that Mrs. Walsh had been cooperative throughout the process. She had admitted to taking the items and explained that she was buying a gift for her daughter's birthday, but didn't have enough money for everything she wanted to purchase. The store manager had decided not to press charges after Mrs. Walsh paid for the items and provided her contact information. The case was closed with a warning, but the file contained a follow-up note written 3 weeks later. Officer Kim had stopped by Mrs. Walsh's address during a routine patrol to check on her welfare. She was doing well, the officer noted, and had found part-time work at a local bakery. The follow-up visit wasn't required by policy, but Officer Kim had taken the time anyway, recognizing that sometimes people needed to know that the system cared about their circumstances as well as their actions. These small acts of humanity embedded in official procedures gave the archive its particular weight. Each file contained not just the facts of crimes and violations, but evidence of human beings trying to navigate their relationships with each other and with the law. The police officers who had written these reports brought their own understanding and compassion to their work, transforming routine enforcement into something resembling social care. Chun pulled another drawer, this one from 1988, and found herself looking at case 1988-0823, a domestic disturbance call from January of that year. Officer Thompson had responded to a complaint from neighbors about shouting and the sound of breaking glass, coming from the Morrison apartment on Clearwater Street. When he arrived, Thompson found James Morrison, age 34, and his wife Linda, age 31, in the midst of what the report characterized as a heated argument about household finances. A drinking glass had been broken during the dispute, but neither party had been injured. Both residents declined to press charges against each other and agreed to continue their discussion at a lower volume. Officer Thompson's report contained more detail than strictly necessary for a resolved domestic call. He noted that the Morrisons had been married for 8 years and had 2 young children who were staying with Linda's mother during the incident. James had recently lost his job at the textile plant, and the family was struggling to make rent payments. Linda had taken a second job cleaning offices in the evening, leaving James to care for the children while dealing with his own feelings of inadequacy and frustration. The officer's recommendation was that the family be referred to social services for assistance with job placement and financial counseling. He included contact information for 3 local agencies in his report and noted that he had provided the same information to the Morrisons before leaving their apartment. No further calls were logged from that address. The case was marked resolved and filed away, but it stood as evidence of police work that extended beyond simple law enforcement into the realm of community support. Officer Thompson had recognized that the underlying problems that led to the disturbance wouldn't be solved by arrests or warnings, only by addressing the economic stress that had created the conflict in the first place. The basement grew quieter as the night progressed, the building settling into its deepest sleep. Chun found herself moving more slowly through the files, allowing each case to register fully before moving to the next. The archive demanded this kind of patience, this willingness to sit with stories that had no dramatic climax, no satisfying resolution. Case 1989-1156 involved a series of reports about an elderly man named Frank Kowalski who had been walking through downtown neighborhoods late at night, not committing any crimes, but causing concern among residents who called police about a suspicious person in their area. Officer Davis had first encountered Mr. Kowalski on a Tuesday night in June, walking slowly down Maple Street at 2:30 a.m. The officer had stopped to speak with him and learned that Kowalski, age 78, suffered from insomnia and found that walking helped him manage his restlessness. He lived alone in a small apartment 6 blocks away and had been taking these walks for several months. The officer's report noted that Kowalski was completely coherent and presented no threat to himself or others. He carried identification and was familiar with the layout of the neighborhood. His late-night walks were simply his way of coping with sleeplessness that had begun after his wife died the previous year. Over the following months, various officers encountered Mr. Kowalski during his nocturnal wanderings. Each interaction was documented in brief reports that painted a picture of a lonely man trying to fill the empty hours when sleep wouldn't come. The officers began to recognize him and would often stop to chat briefly during their patrols. checking on his welfare without treating him as a suspect or nuisance. The reports stopped appearing in November, and a final entry from Officer Martinez noted that Mr. Kowalski had moved to an assisted living facility, closer to his daughter in another city. The case was marked closed, but it served as a record of how police officers had chosen to treat an unusual situation with compassion rather than suspicion. These files, Chen realized, were more than just legal documentation. They were a form of social archaeology, preserving not just crimes, but the community responses to them. They revealed how people lived together, how they failed each other, and how they tried to repair the damage when things went wrong. She pulled one final file from the 1989 drawer. Case 1989 to 2234, which documented an incident of graffiti in the underpass near Central Park. The vandalism had been discovered by maintenance workers on a Monday morning and reported to police as destruction of public property. Officer Chang had investigated the incident and found that someone had spray painted an elaborate mural covering nearly 30 feet of concrete wall. The artwork depicted a cityscape with flowing text in several languages, including what appeared to be poetry in Spanish and English. The technical quality of the work was noted in the report as being quite sophisticated. Rather than simply documenting the vandalism for prosecution, Officer Chang had taken photographs of the mural and included them in the case file. He had also spoken with several community members who used the underpass regularly, finding that most considered the artwork an improvement over the blank concrete wall. The investigating officer had contacted the city's Arts Council and the Parks Department to discuss the possibility of commissioning the unknown artist to create similar works in designated areas. His report included a recommendation that the existing mural be preserved and that the city develop a program for legal street art that could channel creative energy into community improvement rather than property destruction. The mural was eventually painted over according to city policy. But Officer Chang's report had sparked a conversation about public art that led to the establishment of several legal graffiti walls in city parks. The case file documented not just a crime, but the beginning of a broader community dialogue about creativity, public space, and young people's need for expression. As Chun closed the final file and returned it to its place in the metal drawer, she felt the weight of all these stories settling around her like a blanket. The archive was a repository of human experience, preserved in the careful language of police reports, but containing multitudes of unspoken complexity. The clock now showed 3:15 a.m., and the building had grown completely still except for the constant hum of the ventilation system and the distant tick of the wall clock. The fluorescent lights continued their steady glow, illuminating thousands of files that waited patiently for the next reader to discover their contents. Each cabinet contained years of human struggle and resilience, documented by police officers who had chosen to see their work as more than simple law enforcement. They had preserved not just the facts of crimes, but evidence of a community trying to care for itself, one incident at a time. Chun turned off the lights and made her way toward the elevator, leaving the archive to its quiet vigil. The stories would wait there, filed in their proper order, ready to remind anyone who cared to look that even the smallest human conflicts carried weight and meaning, and that sometimes the most important police work happened in the space between the crime and its resolution. The city above slept on, unaware of the careful record being kept of its struggles and small triumphs. The endless documentation of how people tried to live together in spite of their differences and difficulties. The archive breathed quietly in the darkness, holding its secrets close, waiting for morning to bring new stories to file away in their proper places. The morning shift brought with it the familiar rhythm of report writing, a steady percussion of keyboards and rustling papers that filled the detective bureau with purposeful quiet. Detective Martinez settled at his desk with a steaming cup of coffee and the stack of incident reports that had accumulated overnight. each one waiting to be expanded from the brief notes taken at the scene into the detailed documentation that would become part of the permanent record. Report 1990 to 3456 lay before him, concerning a residential burglary that had been discovered the previous evening when Mrs. Eleanor Hartman returned from her bridge club meeting to find her front door standing open. Officer Bennett had responded to the initial call and completed the preliminary documentation, but now the case required the thorough investigation that would transform scattered observations into a complete narrative. Martinez began with the physical evidence, carefully documenting the point of entry through Mrs. Hartman's kitchen window. The screen had been cut with a sharp instrument, leaving clean edges that suggested someone familiar with this method of access. The window latch showed scratches consistent with being forced from the outside, and several paint chips had fallen to the kitchen floor during the process. Inside the house, the burglar had moved through the rooms with apparent method rather than haste. The living room had been searched systematically, with couch cushions removed and replaced, drawers opened and contents examined, but not scattered. Mrs. Hartman's jewelry box had been emptied of several valuable pieces, but costume jewelry had been left behind, suggesting someone with knowledge of precious metals and stones. The television and stereo equipment remained untouched, despite being easily portable and valuable. Instead, the burglar had focused on small items that could be quickly concealed and easily converted to cash. A collection of silver coins that Mrs. Hartman kept in her bedroom dresser had been taken, along with several gold necklaces and a diamond ring that had belonged to her mother. Martinez documented each missing item with care, noting not just its monetary value, but its personal significance to the victim. The diamond ring, Mrs. Hartman had explained, had been worn by her mother for 43 years of marriage and had never left the older woman's finger until her death 2 years earlier. The silver coins had been collected over decades, each one representing a special occasion or memorable trip. The detective's report captured more than just the facts of the crime. It preserved Mrs. Hartman's sense of violation, her distress at losing items that connected her to loved ones no longer living. The burglar had taken objects that could be replaced financially, but never emotionally, leaving behind a grief that extended far beyond the monetary loss. As Martinez typed his report, he could hear the steady clicking of keyboards around the detective bureau as his colleagues worked through their own cases. Detective Washington was documenting a hit-and-run accident from the previous weekend, carefully reconstructing the sequence of events from witness statements and physical evidence left at the scene. Detective Thompson had spread crime scene photographs across his desk while writing his report on a vandalism case at Roosevelt Elementary School. Someone had spray-painted messages on the school's exterior walls during the weekend, and Thompson was methodically cataloging each instance of damage for the insurance claim and potential prosecution. The reports being written in this room would join thousands of others in the filing system that stretched through multiple floors of the building. Each one represented hours of careful observation and documentation, the patient work of transforming chaotic real-world events into ordered narratives that could be filed, retrieved, and referenced for years to come. Martinez moved from the physical evidence to witness interviews, documenting his conversation with Mrs. Patterson, who lived across the street from Mrs. Hartman. She had been watering her garden around 2:30 in the afternoon when she noticed a blue sedan parked in front of the Hartman house. The car had been there for about 20 minutes, which struck her as unusual since Mrs. Hartman typically hosted visitors in the evening rather than during the day. Mrs. Patterson couldn't provide a license plate number, but she described the vehicle as a mid-sized sedan, possibly a Buick or Oldsmobile, with what appeared to be primer spots on the passenger door. She hadn't seen the driver clearly, but thought it might have been a young man with dark hair who had walked around to the backyard rather than approaching the front door. The detectives Report captured not just Mrs. Patterson's observations, but the context that made them significant. She had lived across from Mrs. Hartman for 16 years and was familiar with the pattern of visitors to the house. Her daily gardening routine gave her an unconscious awareness of neighborhood activity that made her notice when something seemed out of place. Martinez documented similar interviews with 3 other neighbors, each one contributing small pieces of information that might eventually form a complete picture of the crime. Mr. Rodriguez, who lived 2 houses down, had heard a car door slam around 3 p.m., but hadn't looked to see which house the sound came from. Mrs. Kim, walking her dog on the adjacent street, had noticed a man in dark clothing walking quickly away from the area around that same time. Each witness statement was carefully transcribed and signed, becoming part of a documentary record that preserved not just facts, but the community's collective memory of the incident. The reports captured how neighbors looked out for each other, how small observations made by people going about their daily routines could combine to create a detailed picture of criminal activity. The report writing process continued through the morning as detectives worked through cases that spanned the full spectrum of human behavior. Detective Foster was documenting a check fraud case involving a local business owner who had allegedly been cashing stolen checks at multiple banks around the city. The investigation had required weeks of coordination with financial institutions and careful analysis of handwriting samples and signature comparisons. Detective Park was completing her report on a missing person case that had resolved when the subject returned home after spending 3 days with friends in another city without informing her family. The case had required extensive investigation, including coordination with police departments in 3 counties and interviews with dozens of potential witnesses, all of which needed to be documented even though the person had returned safely. These reports would become part of the permanent record, filed away in the growing archive that documented the city's ongoing struggle with crime and disorder. But they also served immediate practical purposes, providing detailed information that could be used to identify patterns, link related cases, and support prosecution efforts when suspects were identified and arrested. Martinez returned to his burglary report, adding details about the fingerprint evidence collected at the scene. The crime scene technician had lifted several partial prints from the window frame and kitchen counter, though initial comparison with the automated fingerprint database had not produced any matches. The prints would be preserved and could be compared with any suspects who might be developed through other investigative leads. The detective also documented the method used to secure the scene after the investigation was complete. Mrs. Hartman's daughter had arrived to install temporary locks and arrange for window repairs, and a patrol unit would include the house in its regular checks for the next several weeks. These precautions were noted in the report to establish that reasonable steps had been taken to prevent repeat victimization. As the morning progressed, the detective bureau filled with the quiet sounds of concentrated work. Phones rang occasionally as detectives followed up on leads or coordinated with other agencies, but most of the noise came from keyboards and the soft rustle of papers being organized and filed. The report writing process required sustained attention to detail, the ability to transform scattered observations into coherent narratives that would stand up to legal scrutiny. Detective Chun arrived at her desk with a case file that had been developing for several weeks. Someone had been breaking into cars in the downtown parking garage, taking small items and occasionally stealing entire vehicles. She had been tracking the pattern of incidents and was now ready to compile her findings into a comprehensive report that would be used to brief patrol officers and guide prevention efforts. Car break-ins had begun in early September with isolated incidents on different levels of the parking garage. Initially, they had seemed random, but Chun's analysis had revealed a pattern that suggested someone with detailed knowledge of the garage's layout and security procedures. The crimes occurred during specific time periods when security patrols were focused on other areas of the building. Chun's report documented each incident in chronological order, noting the time, location, method of entry, and items taken. She had created a map showing the distribution of crimes throughout the garage and identified the most vulnerable areas where additional security measures might be effective. The report included recommendations for improved lighting, modified patrol schedules, and coordination with private security personnel. The document she was creating would become more than just a record of crimes. It would serve as a planning tool for prevention efforts and a resource for other investigators working on similar cases. The careful analysis and documentation would transform a series of random incidents into actionable intelligence that could be used to protect potential victims. Detective Williams worked at the desk beside Chun, completing a report on domestic violence case that had resulted in arrest and charges. The incident had occurred 3 days earlier, but the report required careful documentation of witness statements, medical records, and photographic evidence that would support prosecution efforts. The case involved a Lil Egations that Robert Stevens had assaulted his wife during an argument about household finances. Mrs. Stevens had called police after the incident and had been transported to the hospital for treatment of minor injuries. She had provided a detailed statement about the assault and had agreed to cooperate with prosecution efforts. Williams documented not just the immediate incident, but the history of domestic disturbances at the Stevens household. Police had responded to noise complaints and reports of arguments on several previous occasions. Though Mrs. Stevens had typically declined to press charges or provide statements that could support prosecution, the detectives' report captured the pattern of escalating domestic violence that often preceded serious physical injury or death. The documentation would provide prosecutors with the context they needed to argue for appropriate charges and sentencing, and would be available to guide future police responses if additional incidents occurred. The report writing process extended beyond simple documentation to include analysis and recommendation. Williams noted that Mrs. Stevens had expressed concern about her safety if her husband was released on bail, and recommended that the court be informed of the potential for retaliation. The report included contact information for domestic violence services and documented that Mrs. Stevens had been provided with resources for emergency shelter and legal assistance. As afternoon arrived, the Detective Bureau maintained its steady rhythm of documentation and analysis. Each report being written represented hours of investigative work, but also contributed to the larger body of knowledge that helped the department understand crime patterns and develop effective responses. Detective Rodriguez was completing a report on credit card fraud that had involved coordination with federal authorities and financial institutions across multiple states. The case had taken months to investigate and had resulted in the identification of an organized group that had been manufacturing and distributing counterfeit credit cards. The report documented the complex investigation that had begun with a single complaint from a local merchant about suspicious transactions. Through careful analysis of purchase patterns and coordination with credit card companies, Rodriguez had identified a network of individuals using sophisticated equipment to create fake cards and steal personal information. The investigation had required surveillance, undercover operations, and coordination with federal agencies that had jurisdiction over interstate financial crimes. Rodriguez's report captured not just the facts of the crimes, but the investigative methods that had led to successful prosecution of the entire criminal organization. Detective Patel worked on a case involving embezzlement at a local nonprofit organization. Someone had been systematically stealing money from accounts intended to support community programs, and the investigation had required detailed analysis of financial records spanning several years. The report documented how small amounts of money had been diverted from various accounts over an extended period, creating a total loss of nearly $50,000. The crimes had been discovered when a new bookkeeper noticed discrepancies in the organization's financial statements and requested a police investigation. Patel's report captured the methodical nature of the embezzlement and the sophisticated understanding of accounting procedures that had allowed it to continue undetected for so long. The documentation would support not just criminal charges but civil recovery efforts to return stolen funds to the organization. The afternoon brought additional cases requiring documentation and analysis. Detective Murphy was writing a report on a series of bicycle thefts that had occurred near the university campus. The crimes appeared to be the work of a single individual who had developed an effective method for defeating cable locks and quickly removing bikes from campus racks. Murphy had coordinated with university security and had identified several witnesses who had seen a man loading bicycles into a van near the campus. The report documented the witness descriptions and included recommendations for improved security measures that could reduce bicycle theft in the area. As evening approached, the Detective Bureau gradually emptied as investigators completed their reports and prepared to hand off active cases to the night shift. The stack of completed reports would be reviewed by supervisors, copied for distribution to relevant agencies, and filed in the archives that preserve the department's institutional memory. Detective Martinez completed his burglary report as the sun was setting outside the bureau windows. The document he had created would join thousands of similar reports in the filing system, each one preserving a complete record of criminal activity and police response. The report served multiple purposes, from supporting prosecution efforts to guiding prevention strategies, but they also created a detailed historical record of the community's ongoing struggle with crime and disorder. The quiet efficiency of the report writing process reflected the professionalism and dedication of the investigators who transformed chaotic criminal incidents into ordered documentation. Each report represented not just police work, but community service, the patient effort to understand and respond to the problems that disrupted neighborhood peace and individual security. The Bureau grew quiet as detectives finished their work and departed for home, leaving behind stacks of completed reports that would be processed and filed according to established procedures. The documentation they had created would become part of the permanent record, preserved for future reference and analysis by investigators who might work these cases for months or years to come. In the silence that followed, the reports themselves seemed to hold the weight of the stories they contained. The careful documentation of human conflict and police response that formed the foundation of law enforcement work. Each page represented hours of careful observation and analysis, transformed into narratives that would endure long after the crimes themselves had been forgotten by everyone except those who had been directly affected. The archive waited to receive these new additions to its collection. Another day's worth of human experience, carefully documented and preserved for future generations who might need to understand how their community had dealt with crime and disorder in an earlier era. The reports would take their place among thousands of others, creating a comprehensive record of law enforcement, work that extended far beyond simple crime statistics, to capture the complexity of human behavior and social response at the archive's deepest level. Had not seen regular visitors in over 2 years. Records clerk Janet Morrison descended the narrow staircase with a flashlight in one hand and a requisition form in the other, searching for a file that had been requested by the district attorney's office for a case that was finally going to trial after a decade of delays and appeals. The air grew thicker as she moved deeper underground, heavy with the scent of aging paper and the metallic tang of old filing cabinets that had begun to show spots of rust despite the building's climate control system. Somewhere in these forgotten rows lay case 1978 to 5623, a robbery investigation that had never been fully resolved but was now needed to establish a pattern of behavior for a suspect who had finally been apprehended for similar crimes. Her footsteps echoed against concrete walls that had been painted institutional green sometime in the 1960s and had not been refreshed since. The paint had begun to peel in places, creating abstract patterns that seemed to shift in the beam of her flashlight. Row upon row of filing cabinets stretched into the darkness, each one containing hundreds of cases that had once demanded urgent attention but now waited silently for the occasional researcher or legal inquiry. The filing system in this section followed an older organizational scheme that had been abandoned in the early 1980s when the department modernized its record-keeping procedures. Cases were arranged by type rather than chronology, creating odd juxtapositions where armed robberies from 1975 sat next to burglaries from 1979. Connected only by the nature of the crimes, they documented. Morrison found the robbery section and began working her way through the drawers, reading case numbers by flashlight until she located the correct file. Case 1978 to 5623 was thicker than she had expected, filled with witness statements, crime scene photographs, and investigative reports that had accumulated over several months of active investigation. The case concerned a series of robberies at small convenience stores throughout the east side of the city. The perpetrator had followed a consistent pattern, entering stores late in the evening when only a single clerk was on duty, displaying a handgun and demanding money from the cash register. No one had been injured during any of the robberies, but the psychological impact on the victims had been significant. Detective Raymond Kowalski had been the primary investigator, and his reports filled most of the file, written in the careful block letters that characterized police documentation of that era. Each report captured not just the facts of the crimes, but the methodical investigation that had followed each incident. Morrison carried the file to a small reading area that had been set up near the archive's main desk. A single lamp provided enough light to examine the documents, casting long shadows across pages that had yellowed with age. The typewritten text had faded in places but remained legible, preserving Detective Kowalski's careful documentation of an investigation that had consumed months of his professional life. The first robbery had occurred on March 15, 1978, at Murphy's Corner Store on Elm Street. Patricia Murphy, the owner's daughter, had been working alone when a man entered around 9:30 p.m. She described him as being in his 20s, average height, wearing a dark jacket and baseball cap that obscured his face. He had spoken quietly, almost politely, when he demanded money from the register. Detective Kowalski's report noted that the robber had seemed familiar with the store's layout and had known exactly where the cash register was located. He had taken only the bills, leaving the coins behind, and had left through the rear exit rather than the front door where he might have been seen by passing traffic. Patricia Murphy had been deeply shaken by the incident, and Kowalski's report captured not just her description of the crime, but her emotional state following the robbery. She had considered quitting her job at the store and had difficulty sleeping for weeks after the incident. The detective had provided her with information about victim services and had followed up several times to check on her recovery. The second robbery occurred 3 weeks later at Jackson's Market on 5th Street. The pattern was nearly identical, with a young man entering late in the evening, displaying a handgun and demanding money from the cash register. The clerk, Marcus Jackson, provided a similar description of the perpetrator, though he noted that the man had seemed nervous and had kept looking toward the front windows as if watching for police. Morrison turned through pages of witness statements, crime scene sketches, and investigative reports that documented Detective Kowalski's methodical approach to linking the crimes. He had identified similarities in the perpetrator's behavior, the timing of the robberies, and the geographic pattern that suggested someone familiar with the Neighborhood. The file contained photographs of the crime scenes. Black and white images that captured the modest interiors of small neighborhood stores. The pictures showed narrow aisles stocked with groceries and household items, cash registers that had been emptied of bills, and the everyday details of businesses that served working-class communities. Detective Kowalski had canvassed the neighborhoods around each store, speaking with residents and business owners who might have noticed suspicious activity. His reports documented dozens of interviews with people who had seen nothing unusual, creating a record of negative results that was as important as positive leads in understanding the scope of the investigation. The third robbery occurred in May at Chun's Grocery on Riverside Drive. By this time, word of the previous crimes had spread through the community, and store owners had begun taking additional precautions. Mr. Chun had installed a security camera above his cash register, though the perpetrator had apparently been aware of its presence and had kept his face turned away from the lens. The security footage, preserved in the file as a series of still photographs, showed a figure in dark clothing moving through the store. While his face wasn't visible, the images captured his general build and movement patterns. Detective Kowalski had studied the photographs carefully, noting the way the man walked and held himself, details that might help identify him if other evidence developed. Morrison continued, reading through the investigation reports. Following Detective Kowalski's efforts to establish connections between the crimes and identify potential suspects, he had worked with other detectives to review similar cases from previous years, looking for patterns that might link these robberies to earlier crimes or help predict where the perpetrator might strike next. The file contained evidence of extensive coordination with patrol officers who had increased their presence in areas where additional robberies might occur. Detective Kowalski had prepared detailed briefings about the crimes and the suspect description, ensuring that every officer in the affected districts knew what to look for during their regular patrols. As summer arrived, the robberies stopped as suddenly as they had begun. No additional crimes fitting the same pattern were reported, and despite months of continued investigation, Detective Kowalski was never able to identify the perpetrator. The case remained open but inactive, filed away with hundreds of other unsolved crimes that had exhausted available investigative leads. Morrison found this outcome typical of many cases in the older archives. Before modern forensic techniques and computer databases, investigations often reached dead ends despite the best efforts of dedicated detectives. Cases like this one documented not just crimes, but the limitations of investigative technology and the challenges facing police officers who worked without the tools that later generations would take for granted. The file contained a final report written by Detective Kowalski 6 months after the last robbery. He summarized the investigation and recommended that the case remain open pending development of new leads or similar crimes that might be connected to the same perpetrator. His writing showed the frustration of a thorough investigator who had exhausted every available avenue without achieving resolution. Morrison closed the file and prepared to return it to the district attorney's office. But something about the archive's atmosphere made her reluctant to leave immediately. The silence down here was complete, except for the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional settling sound of the building above. It was a place where time seemed suspended, where cases from decades past waited patiently for the day when they might finally be resolved. She walked deeper into the archive, past sections containing cases from the 1970s and into areas where files from the 1960s were stored. The filing cabinets in this section were older models, made of heavier steel and painted in colors that had been fashionable when the building was first constructed. Many of the labels had begun to fade, making it difficult to locate specific cases without careful examination. The cases from this era reflected a different style of police work, when investigations relied more heavily on personal relationships and community knowledge than on scientific analysis. Detective reports were often shorter but contained rich descriptions of neighborhood dynamics and social connections that helped explain criminal behavior within its broader context. Morrison opened a drawer from 1965 and found herself looking at case 1965 to 2847, a breaking and entering investigation that had involved multiple homes in the same neighborhood over a period of several weeks. The perpetrator had consistently targeted houses during daytime hours when residents were at work, taking small valuable items and leaving behind minimal evidence. Detective William Barnes had investigated the case, and his reports revealed a methodical approach to understanding the neighborhood dynamics that might explain how the burglar selected his targets. Barnes had spent weeks walking through the area, noting patterns of activity that might indicate when houses were likely to be unoccupied. The detective's reports contained detailed descriptions of the neighborhood itself, capturing a community where neighbors knew each other's schedules and looked out for each other's property. The burglaries had disrupted this sense of security, creating suspicion and fear among residents who had previously felt safe leaving their homes unlocked during the day. Detective Barnes had eventually solved the case by identifying a local teenager who had been observing the neighborhood's patterns and targeting homes when he knew residents would be away. The investigation had required patience and careful observation rather than scientific analysis, relying on the detective's ability to understand human behavior and community dynamics. Morrison continued exploring the older sections of the archive, finding cases that documented a city very different from the one that existed today. The crimes were often smaller in scale, involving amounts of money that would seem insignificant by contemporary standards. But the investigations were no less thorough or professional than modern cases. File from 1963 contained the investigation of a series of vandalism incidents at Lincoln High School. Someone had been breaking windows and spray painting messages on the building's exterior walls during weekend nights. Detective Joseph Murphy had approached the case as a community problem rather than simply a criminal matter, working with school administrators and neighborhood residents to understand the underlying issues that might be motivating the vandalism. The investigation had revealed tensions between different groups of students and conflicts over school policies that had created resentment among some young people. Detective Murphy's reports documented not just the crimes, but the social dynamics that had contributed to them, leading to changes in school policies and community programs that addressed the root causes of the problem. These older cases showed police work as community service, with officers functioning as problem solvers and mediators rather than simply law enforcers. The reports captured a time when police officers were expected to understand their communities intimately and to work collaboratively with residents to address problems before they escalated into serious crimes. Morrison found herself drawn to a section containing files from the early 1960s, cases that documented the city during a period of significant social and economic change. Many of the crimes reflected tensions between different communities as neighborhoods evolved and longtime residents struggled to adapt to changing demographics. Case 196-21456 involved a series of confrontations between groups of young people from different parts of the city who had begun gathering in downtown parks during weekend evenings. While no serious crimes had been committed, the gatherings had created tension and led to several complaints from business owners and residents. Detective Robert Chin had been assigned to investigate the situation, and his reports showed a careful attempt to understand the social dynamics underlying the confrontations. Rather than simply arresting participants, Chan had spent time talking with young people from all the groups involved, learning about their concerns and the factors that had led to conflict. The detective's investigation revealed that the confrontations were symptoms of larger problems related to limited recreational opportunities for young people and economic pressures that were affecting families throughout the community. His recommendations led to the creation of new youth programs and community centers that provided positive outlets for young people's energy and helped reduce tensions between different groups. The archive contained thousands of such cases, each one documenting not just criminal activity, but the community's ongoing effort to understand and address the social problems that contributed to crime and disorder. The investigations preserved in these files showed police officers functioning as social workers, community organizers, and problem solvers as much as law enforcers. As Morrison prepared to leave the archive, she paused at a section containing the oldest files in the collection. Cases from the 1950s that documented a city emerging from the post-war period into an era of economic growth and social change. The filing cabinets in this section were museum pieces made of wood and metal in styles that had not been manufactured for decades. The cases from this era were written by hand or typed on manual typewriters that created uneven impressions on thin paper that had become fragile with age. The language was formal and precise, reflecting training and procedures that emphasized careful documentation and thorough investigation, even when technology was limited. Case 195408892 documented the investigation of a burglary at Brennan's hardware store on Main Street. Someone had broken into the store during the night and stolen tools and equipment worth approximately $200. Detective Patrick Sullivan had conducted the investigation using methods that would be familiar to any modern investigator, despite the absence of sophisticated forensic techniques. Sullivan's reports showed careful attention to physical evidence, detailed interviews with potential witnesses, and systematic follow-up on all investigative leads. He had solved the case by identifying a former employee who had knowledge of the store's layout and had been experiencing financial difficulties. The investigation had required patience and persistence rather than scientific analysis, but the methodology was sound and professional. The archive preserved not just these individual cases, but the evolution of police work itself, documenting how investigative techniques had developed over decades while the fundamental principles of thorough documentation and careful analysis remained constant. Each generation of officers had built upon the work of their predecessors, creating an institutional memory that extended far beyond any individual career. Morrison finally made her way back toward the archive's entrance, carrying the file that had brought her here, but also carrying a deeper appreciation for the historical record preserved in these forgotten cabinets. Every case represented hours of professional work by dedicated officers who had understood their responsibility to document and preserve the community's ongoing struggle with crime and disorder. The archive waited silently for the next researcher, the next legal inquiry, the next attempt to understand patterns of human behavior through the careful examination of police records. In the darkness between the filing cabinets, thousands of stories rested patiently, preserved in fading ink and yellowing paper, ready to reveal their secrets to anyone with the patience to read them carefully. The dust continued to settle on everything equally, creating a uniform coating that made no distinction between solved cases and mysteries that remained open after decades of investigation. Time moved differently in the archive, where urgent investigations from past eras had become historical artifacts, but where the careful work of documentation ensured that nothing was ever completely forgotten. Each file remained exactly where it had been placed, waiting for the day when someone might need the information it contained, when patterns established decades earlier might finally make sense in the context of new investigations or changing understanding of criminal behavior. The archive breathed quietly in its basement sanctuary, holding its secrets close while remaining, always ready to share them with those who knew how to ask the right questions. The Jefferson County Courthouse closed its Doors to the public at 5:30 each evening. But the building never truly emptied. Security guard Thomas Mitchell began his rounds at 6 o'clock, walking through corridors that had witnessed decades of legal proceedings, his footsteps creating a steady rhythm against polished marble floors that reflected the dim emergency lighting. Courtroom 3I had been the site of the morning's sentencing hearing for a burglary case that had roamed through the system for 8 months. Judge Harrison had handed down a sentence of 18 months in county jail, bringing closure to a case that had begun with a break-in at elderly Mrs. Rodriguez's home the previous autumn. Now the courtroom sat empty, its wooden benches arranged in perfect rows. Waiting for tomorrow's docket of cases, Mitchell paused in the doorway, his flashlight beam sweeping across the judge's bench, where so many decisions had been rendered over the years. The raised platform commanded the room with quiet authority, even in darkness, its mahogany surface polished smooth by decades of use. Behind the bench, the state flag and American flag hung motionless in the still air, their colors muted in the emergency lighting. The witness stand occupied a place of honor beside the judge's bench, positioned so that testimony could be heard clearly throughout the courtroom. Thousands of people had sat in that chair over the years, some telling the truth, others attempting deception, all of them part of the endless human drama that unfolded within these walls. The microphone remained in place, ready for the next day's proceedings, though now it captured only the subtle sounds of the building settling into its nighttime rest. Mitchell continued his rounds, moving through the hallway that connected the building's 4 main courtrooms. Each door bore a small placard indicating the judge who presided there and the types of cases typically heard in that room. Courtroom 1B handled civil matters, its atmosphere more subdued than the criminal courts where freedom and imprisonment hung in the balance. Courtroom 2, specialized in family law, where custody battles and divorce proceedings played out their intimate dramas before neutral judges who had seen every variation of human relationship failure. Security guards' route took him past the jury assembly room, where citizens called to serve would gather each morning before being assigned to specific trials. The rows of uncomfortable plastic chairs sat empty now, but during the day they would fill with people who had been summoned to participate in the justice system, most of them reluctant but dutiful, understanding their role in the democratic process even when it inconvenienced their daily lives. Mitchell unlocked the door to the jury deliberation room adjacent to courtroom 3A, checking to ensure that no materials from the day's proceedings had been left behind. The room contained a long wooden table surrounded by 12 chairs, each one representing a citizen's voice in determining guilt or innocence. The walls were bare except for basic instructions about jury procedures and a clock that had measured the deliberations of countless cases. This particular room had recently been the site of deliberations in an assault case that had divided the jury for nearly 6 hours. The defendant had been accused of attacking a neighbor during a dispute over property lines, and the evidence had been complicated enough to require extensive discussion among the jurors before they reached their verdict. The room had contained all of their uncertainty, their careful examination of testimony and evidence, their ultimate decision to convict on lesser charges than those originally sought by the prosecution. The security guard locked the deliberation room and continued toward the building's detention area, where defendants awaiting trial or sentencing were held during court proceedings. The holding cells were located in the basement level, connected to the courtrooms by a secure corridor that allowed prisoners to be transported without contact with the public areas of the building. The detention area operated under different rules than the rest of the courthouse, with reinforced doors, security cameras, and procedures designed to ensure both public safety and the humane treatment of prisoners. Deputy Sheriff Marie Santos supervised this area during court hours, maintaining order among defendants who often faced uncertain futures and high levels of stress and anxiety. Cell Block A contained 6 individual holding cells, each one equipped with a metal bench and basic sanitary facilities. The cells were designed for temporary detention rather than long-term imprisonment, but they had housed thousands of defendants over the years as cases made their way through the court system. Some prisoners spent only hours in these cells, released on their own recognizance or posting bail quickly. Others returned repeatedly over months or years as their cases were continued and rescheduled. Mitchell checked each cell according to his security protocol, ensuring that all locks were secure and that no contraband had been left behind by the day's occupants. Cell 3 had held Marcus Thompson during his sentencing hearing that morning, the same defendant who had received 18 months for burglary. Thompson had sat quietly on the metal bench, perhaps contemplating the impact that his actions would have on his family and his future employment prospects. The security guard's flashlight illuminated the sparse interior of each cell, revealing the basic accommodations that represented temporary stops in the journey through the criminal justice system. The walls bore no decoration except for the occasional scratch mark or initial carved by previous occupants, small attempts to leave some trace of their presence in these anonymous spaces. Adjacent to the holding cells lay the attorney conference room, where defense lawyers met with their clients to discuss strategy and prepare for court appearances. The room contained only a table and 2 chairs, but it had been the site of countless, crucial conversations between attorneys and defendants as they worked together to navigate the complex legal process. Mitchell remembered observing some of these conferences during his years as a courthouse security guard. He had seen public defenders working with multiple clients in a single day, often meeting people for the first time just hours before their court appearances. He had witnessed private attorneys spending hours with their clients, carefully reviewing evidence and preparing testimony. The conference room had contained all of these interactions, the professional relationships that formed under stress as lawyers and clients worked together toward the best possible outcomes. The security guard locked the detention area and returned to the main level of the courthouse, where the administrative offices maintained their own nighttime silence. The clerk's office contained files for thousands of active cases, each one representing some form of legal dispute or criminal charge that was working its way through the system. During the day, this office buzzed with activity as clerks processed paperwork, scheduled hearings, and provided information to attorneys and defendants. Now the office sat quiet, its computer terminals displaying screensavers and its filing cabinets locked for the night. The files inside contained the documentary evidence of the community's ongoing struggle with crime and conflict, from simple traffic violations to complex felony cases that had required months of investigation and prosecution. Mitchell checked the locks on the filing cabinets that contained sensitive case materials and evidence records. These files were protected by multiple layers of security, ensuring that confidential information about ongoing cases remained secure while still being accessible to authorized personnel during business hours. The filing system represented decades of legal proceedings, carefully organized and preserved for future reference by judges, attorneys, and appellate courts. The courthouse law library occupied the building's second floor, containing legal texts and precedents that judges and attorneys consulted when researching complex cases. The library remained accessible to attorneys working late on case preparation, but during the overnight hours, it sat empty, its shelves of law books creating a scholarly atmosphere that contrasted with the more practical concerns of the courtrooms below. Mitchell walked through the library's reading area, where attorneys had spent countless hours researching statutes and case law that might support their arguments. The tables were equipped with legal research terminals and space for spreading out case files and documents. The library had been the site of preparation for many of the trials that had played out in the courtrooms below, the quiet workspace where legal strategies were developed and refined. The security guard's route included the building's record storage area, where older case files were archived according to retention schedules established by state law. These files documented legal proceedings from previous decades, preserving the documentary evidence of how the community had dealt with crime and conflict over time. Most of these files would never be accessed again, but they remained available for appellate reviews, academic research, and the occasional cold case investigation that required historical context. The storage area contained row upon row of bankers' boxes, each one labeled with case numbers and dates that marked their place in the chronological record of local legal proceedings. The boxes represented thousands of human stories, from simple misdemeanors that had been resolved with fines and community service to complex felony cases that had resulted in lengthy prison sentences. Mitchell paused at a section containing files from the early 1990s, when the courthouse had handled a high-profile murder trial that had captured community attention for months. The case had involved domestic violence that had escalated to homicide, and the trial had required weeks of testimony from witnesses, experts, and law enforcement officers. The jury had ultimately convicted the defendant of second-degree murder, and he had been sentenced to life in prison. The files from that case filled multiple boxes containing trial transcripts, evidence photographs, and legal motions that documented every aspect of the proceedings. The case had set precedents for how domestic violence cases were prosecuted in the county, and the files remained available for reference by attorneys handling similar cases in later years. The security guard continued his rounds through the building's administrative areas, checking the offices of the district attorney, public defender, and court administration staff. Each office contained its own files and records related to ongoing cases, creating multiple layers of documentation that ensured the legal process could continue, even when key personnel were unavailable. The district attorney's office maintained files on all active criminal cases, from initial charges through final disposition. The public defender's office contained similar files, documenting their representation of defendants who could not afford private attorneys. Court administration kept records of scheduling, jury management, and building operations that supported the legal proceedings. Mitchell's final stop was the building's evidence storage area, where physical evidence from active cases was preserved under strict security protocols. The storage area contained everything from drugs and weapons seized during arrests to documents and photographs that would be presented during trials. Each piece of evidence was carefully cataloged and secured to ensure its integrity for court proceedings. The evidence storage area operated under the most stringent security measures in the building, with multiple locks, security cameras, and access logs that tracked every person who entered the area and every piece of evidence that was removed for court proceedings. The chain of custody requirements meant that every movement of evidence was documented to ensure that it remained admissible in court. As Mitchell completed his security rounds and returned to his post at the building's main entrance, the courthouse settled into its deepest nighttime quiet. The building would remain secure until morning, when attorneys, defendants, witnesses, and court staff would return to continue the endless process of resolving legal disputes and criminal cases. The courthouse stood as a monument to the community's commitment to the rule of law. Its marble halls and wooden courtrooms representing the democratic principle that conflict should be resolved through peaceful legal proceedings rather than violence or vigilante justice. The building had witnessed thousands of human dramas over the decades, from simple traffic violations to complex murder trials, each one contributing to the ongoing development of legal precedent and community standards. During the overnight hours, the courthouse held its memories quietly, its empty courtrooms and locked offices preserving the echoes of legal proceedings that had shaped countless lives. The building served as both a practical facility for conducting legal business and a symbol of the justice system's promise to treat all citizens equally under the law. The security systems that protected the building overnight ensured that court proceedings could resume each morning with confidence that case files, evidence, and facilities remained secure and uncompromised. The courthouse represented one of the community's most important institutions, requiring constant protection to maintain public trust in the legal system. As dawn approached, the courthouse began its subtle transition from nighttime security mode to daytime operational status. The building's systems prepared for another day of legal proceedings, ready to host the human dramas that would unfold in its courtrooms as the community continued its ongoing effort to resolve conflicts through peaceful legal processes. The marble halls that had echoed with Mitchell's footsteps during the night would soon fill with the voices of attorneys, defendants, witnesses, and court staff beginning another day of legal work. The empty courtrooms would come alive with proceedings that continued the centuries-old tradition of democratic justice, each case adding its own chapter to the building's long history of serving the community's legal needs. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window of the Henderson house on Maple Street, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stillness where breakfast conversations had once filled the air with gentle chatter. Mrs. Elizabeth Henderson sat at her small dining table, holding a cup of tea that had grown cold while she stared at the newspaper's crime section, reading about incidents that happened in neighborhoods that felt both distant and impossibly close. 3 blocks away, the Martinez family was beginning their day with the careful routine they had developed since the break-in 6 months earlier. Sophia Martinez checked the locks on all the windows before leaving for work, a habit that had become as automatic as brushing her teeth. Her 8-year-old daughter Maya no longer played in the front yard without supervision, understanding without being told that their world had shifted in some fundamental way. The crime that had touched the Martinez family had been documented as Case 1991 to 4456, a residential burglary that had netted the perpetrator less than $300 in cash and electronics. But the report filed by Detective Wilson could not capture the way Maya now startled at unexpected sounds, or how Sophia's husband Carlos had begun taking different routes home from work, varying his schedule in ways that made him feel more secure. Detective Sarah Chun drove slowly through the Riverside neighborhood during her morning patrol, observing the subtle signs that indicated how crime had woven itself into the fabric of daily life. Windows that had once stood open during warm weather now remained closed and locked. Front porches that had once served as community gathering spaces sat empty except for the occasional resident who ventured outside to collect mail or newspapers. Riverside area had experienced a series of car break-ins during the summer months, crimes that had been documented in reports filed by officers Martinez, Thompson, and Williams. Each incident involved minimal property loss, but collectively they had altered the neighborhood's sense of security in ways that could not be measured in dollar amounts or conviction rates. Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, who lived on the corner of Riverside and Oak, had been among the victims of the car break-ins. Someone had shattered her passenger window to steal a radio worth perhaps $50, but the cost of repairs and the violation of her personal space had affected her far beyond the monetary loss. She now parked her car in the garage that she had previously used for storage, rearranging her life around the fear of repeat victimization. The police reports documented these crimes with professional precision, but they could not capture the way Mrs. Walsh now checked her car windows twice before retiring each night, or how she had begun asking her neighbor Mr. Patterson to keep an eye on her property when she traveled to visit her sister in the next county. Detective Chun's patrol route took her past Lincoln Elementary School, where Principal Janet Morrison had implemented new security procedures following a vandalism incident that had occurred during the previous semester. The crime itself had been minor, involving spray paint and broken windows, but it had prompted conversations about safety that rippled through the entire school community. Teachers now locked their classroom doors during lunch breaks, and the school had installed additional lighting in areas that had previously been considered safe. Parents who had once felt comfortable dropping their children off early now waited until staff members were present to supervise the playground. The vandalism had been solved, and the perpetrator had made restitution. But the changes to daily routines persisted. The school's crossing guard, Mrs. Helen Kim, had worked the same intersection for 12 years and had developed relationships with 3 generations of families in the neighborhood. She noticed changes in how parents interacted with their children during the morning commute, observing more conversations about safety and awareness that had not been necessary in previous years. Mrs. Kim remembered when children had walked to school alone as young as 7 or 8 years old, taking routes through neighborhoods where every adult felt some responsibility for every child's welfare. Now parents drove their children to school even when they lived only a few blocks away, citing concerns about stranger danger and criminal activity that seemed to lurk in spaces that had once felt completely safe. The patrol route continued through the downtown business district, where shop owners had formed an informal network of mutual support following a series of daytime robberies that had occurred 6 months earlier. The crimes had been documented in police reports filed by Detective Rodriguez, who had worked closely with business owners to develop prevention strategies and communication protocols. Frank Mueller, who owned Muller's hardware store on Main Street, had installed a silent alarm system and had arranged with neighboring businesses to watch each other's properties during busy periods. The hardware store had been robbed twice in the span of 3 weeks, crimes that had netted the perpetrators less than $400, but had fundamentally changed how Mr. Mueller approached his daily business operations. The robbery reports filed by Detective Rodriguez contained witness statements from customers who had been present during one of the incidents. Mrs. Patricia Santos had been shopping for gardening supplies when a young man entered the store, displayed a handgun, and demanded money from the cash register. She had cooperated fully with the investigation, providing a detailed description of the perpetrator and his behavior. But Mrs. Santos had not returned to Muller's hardware store in the months following the robbery, instead driving 15 minutes to a larger store in a shopping center where she felt more secure, among crowds of shoppers and professional security personnel. Her absence was noted only by Mr. Mueller, who remembered her as a weekly customer but understood her reluctance to return to a place where she had experienced fear. Detective Chun's patrol included residential areas where families had been touched by crime in ways both direct and indirect. The Johnson family on Elm Street had never been victimized personally, but their next-door neighbors had experienced a break-in that had prompted the Johnsons to install deadbolt locks and motion-activated lights that turned their modest home into something resembling a fortress. Their teenage son, Marcus Johnson, had been questioned by police as a potential witness to suspicious activity in the neighborhood, an experience that had given him a new understanding of how crime investigations affected entire communities rather than just immediate victims. The police interview had been conducted professionally and courteously, but it had made Marcus aware that criminal activity could draw anyone into its orbit without warning. The police report filed by Officer Williams documented Marcus Johnson's statement about seeing an unfamiliar car parked on the street during the hours before the break-in occurred. The teenager's observation had provided important evidence for the investigation, but it had also made him hyper-aware of vehicles and strangers in his neighborhood in ways that changed his daily experience of familiar spaces. Mrs. Rosa Martinez, who lived 2 streets away from the Johnson family, had begun organizing informal neighborhood watch meetings following the series of break-ins that had affected her area. The meetings brought together residents who had previously interacted only in passing, creating relationships that were both supportive and tinged with the anxiety that had prompted their formation. Detective Chun observed these neighborhood changes during her patrols, noting how crime had altered social dynamics in ways that extended far beyond the immediate victims. Neighbors who had once minded their own business now paid careful attention to unfamiliar faces and unusual activities, creating informal surveillance networks that sometimes helped police investigations but also reflected a loss of the relaxed trust that had previously characterized community life. The patrol route included apartment complexes where transient populations created additional challenges for both crime prevention and investigation. The Parkview Arms had experienced several incidents during the past year, crimes that were documented in reports filed by officers Reeves, Chang, and Martinez. The complex housed working families, elderly residents on fixed incomes, and young people just starting their careers, creating a diverse community that was affected differently by criminal activity. Mrs. Angela Foster, who managed the Parkview Arms, had developed protocols for responding to crime that balanced tenant safety with respect for privacy rights. She worked closely with police officers to identify problems before they escalated, but she also understood that heavy-handed security measures could make the complex feel unwelcoming to residents who were already struggling with economic pressures. The apartment complex had installed better lighting and improved locks following a series of mailbox break-ins that had occurred during the winter months. The crimes had been relatively minor, involving theft of checks and personal mail, but they had affected elderly residents who depended on Social Security and pension payments that arrived by mail each month. Detective Chun knew that Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who lived in apartment 3B, had been among the victims of the mailbox thefts. The crime had delayed her receipt of medication refills and had caused her to miss utility payment that resulted in additional fees she could barely afford. The police report documented the financial loss at $37, but it could not capture the way the incident had made Mrs. Patterson feel vulnerable and isolated. The detectives' patrol continued through residential areas where families dealt with the indirect effects of criminal activity that occurred in nearby neighborhoods. Parents found themselves having conversations with children about safety that previous generations had not needed to have, explaining precautions and awareness without creating paralyzing fear. The Wilson family on Oak Street had not been direct victims of crime, but their 12-year-old daughter, Jennifer, had heard about incidents at school and had begun asking questions about why some people committed crimes and whether their family was safe. Her parents had found themselves balancing honesty about community problems with reassurance about personal safety, conversations that were both necessary and challenging. Jennifer Wilson's questions had prompted her parents to research crime statistics and prevention strategies, leading them to participate in community meetings about neighborhood safety. They had installed timer lights and had begun coordinating with neighbors about vacation security, changes that were sensible but represented a departure from the casual approach to home security that had characterized their previous lifestyle. Detective Chun's patrol included commercial areas where business owners had adapted to criminal activity through measures that affected both their operations and their relationships with customers. The corner market on 5th Street had installed security cameras and had hired an armed guard during evening hours. Changes that had reduced crime, but had also altered the casual atmosphere that had previously made the store feel like a neighborhood gathering place. The market's owner, Mr. David Kim, had been forced to balance security concerns with maintaining the welcoming environment that had attracted customers for 15 years. The security measures had been effective in preventing crime, but they had also changed the way customers interacted with staff and each other, creating a more cautious atmosphere that reflected broader community concerns about safety. Police reports documented the crimes that had prompted these security changes, including 2 armed robberies and several incidents of shoplifting that had occurred during a 6-month period. Detective Thompson had investigated these cases and had worked with Mr. Kim to develop prevention strategies that addressed immediate security concerns while preserving the store's role as a community hub. The afternoon brought Detective Chun's patrol through neighborhoods, where families were preparing for evening routines that had been modified by awareness of criminal activity. Children who had once played outside until dark now came indoors earlier, and parents who had once felt comfortable with unsupervised neighborhood exploration now maintained closer supervision of their children's activities. The playground at Riverside Park had once been busy with children and families during evening hours, but recent incidents of vandalism and reports of suspicious activity had reduced its usage during darker hours. The crimes documented in police reports had been relatively minor, but they had affected community use of public spaces in ways that persisted long after the incidents had been resolved. Mrs. Catherine Murphy, who lived adjacent to the park, had noticed the changes in how families used the recreational facilities. She remembered evening softball games and family picnics that had continued well into twilight. Community activities that had been gradually curtailed as safety concerns influenced family decisions about outdoor activities. The police reports filed by Officer Davis documented the vandalism, incidents that had contributed to changed usage patterns at Riverside Park. The crimes had involved graffiti and damage to playground equipment, problems that had been addressed through increased patrols and community cleanup efforts. But the sense of security that had encouraged evening family activities had been more difficult to restore than the physical damage. Detective Chun concluded her patrol as evening approached, returning to the station with observations about how crime had woven itself into the fabric of community life in ways both subtle and profound. The police reports documented individual incidents with professional precision, but they captured only fragments of the broader impact that criminal activity had on neighborhoods, families, and the social connections that held communities together. The station's evening briefing would include discussion of crime statistics and prevention strategies, information that was essential for effective law enforcement, but represented only part of the story about how criminal activity affected the community. The real impact could be seen in changed routines, modified relationships, and the countless small adjustments that families made in response to their awareness of crime's presence in their midst. As darkness settled over the neighborhoods that Detective Chun had patrolled, families throughout the community went about their evening routines with the heightened awareness that had become part of modern life. Doors were locked, windows were checked, and conversations between parents and children included discussions of safety that would help the next generation navigate a world where crime was an acknowledged reality rather than an abstract possibility. The quiet neighborhoods held their secrets close, each house containing families that had been touched by crime either directly or through the ripple effects that spread through communities, when trust was damaged and security could no longer be taken for granted. But they also contained the resilience and mutual support that communities developed in response to challenges, the human capacity to adapt and protect what was most valuable, while maintaining hope for better days ahead. The police station settled into its quieter cadence as the evening shift took over from the day crew. Fluorescent lights dimmed to half intensity in the administrative areas where night duty officers would spend the next 8 hours processing the paperwork that transformed chaotic criminal incidents into ordered documentation. Sergeant Patricia Williams had worked the night shift for 7 years and had grown to appreciate the contemplative atmosphere that descended on the building after the urgent business of daytime policing gave way to the methodical work of record keeping and report writing. Her desk occupied a corner of the detective bureau, where she could observe the steady flow of officers who arrived throughout the evening with cases that required detailed documentation. The night shift handled different types of work than the day crew, focusing less on active investigations and more on the careful processing of incidents that had occurred during the previous 24 hours. Officer Michael Chun arrived at 11:30 p.m. with a domestic disturbance case that had been resolved. without arrests but required thorough documentation for future reference. He settled at his assigned workstation with a cup of coffee and began the process of transforming his handwritten notes into a formal police report that would become part of the permanent record. The domestic disturbance had involved the Morrison family on Cedar Street, a couple in their 40s whose argument about household finances had escalated to the point where neighbors had called police about shouting and the sound of breaking glass. Officer Chun had responded to the call and had found James and Linda Morrison in their living room, surrounded by the fragments of a drinking glass that had been thrown during their heated discussion. Neither party had been injured, and both had declined to press charges against each other. But Officer Chun's report would document the incident for future reference in case additional domestic calls originated from the same address. The report captured not just the immediate facts of the disturbance, but the underlying circumstances that had contributed to the conflict. James Morrison had recently lost his job at the textile manufacturing plant where he had worked for 12 years, and the family was struggling to meet their mortgage payments and other financial obligations. Linda Morrison had taken a part-time job at a local restaurant to supplement their income, but the additional stress and reduced family time had created tension that had finally erupted into the argument that had prompted the police call. Officer Chun's report noted that he had provided the Morrison family with information about counseling services and financial assistance programs that might help them address the underlying problems that had led to the domestic disturbance. His documentation included contact information for 3 local agencies and a note that both parties had agreed to seek professional help with their financial and relationship difficulties. The night shift processing required a different kind of attention than active police work, demanding careful focus on detail and accuracy rather than immediate response to emerging situations. Officer Chun worked slowly through his report, ensuring that every relevant fact was documented and that his observations about the family's circumstances were recorded for future officers who might respond to additional calls from the Morrison residents. At a nearby workstation, Detective Jennifer Park was completing paperwork for a burglary investigation that had been ongoing for several weeks. The case involved a series of break-ins at small businesses in the downtown area, crimes that followed a consistent pattern but had not yet yielded sufficient evidence to identify the perpetrator. Detective Park's night shift work involved reviewing witness statements, crime scene reports, and physical evidence to identify connections between related cases and develop investigative leads that could be pursued during daytime hours. The burglary series had affected 6 different businesses over a 2-month period, each incident involving similar methods of entry and types of property taken. The perpetrator appeared to target businesses that closed early and were located on side streets where activity was limited during evening hours. The break-ins occurred consistently between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m., suggesting someone who was familiar with the area's patterns of activity and knew when businesses would be unoccupied and unwatched. Detective Park's analysis identified commonalities between the crimes that had not been apparent when each incident was investigated separately. The perpetrator used the same method to defeat standard door locks, took similar types of merchandise from each business, and left behind minimal physical evidence that could be used for identification purposes. Her night shift work involved creating a comprehensive report that summarized the investigation's findings and provided recommendations for prevention measures that business owners could implement to reduce their vulnerability to similar crimes. The report would be distributed to patrol officers and would guide continued investigation efforts during subsequent shifts. Officer David Martinez worked at his desk processing a vehicle theft case that had been reported earlier in the day when Mrs. Eleanor Thompson discovered that her 1989 Honda Accord had been stolen from the parking lot of the grocery store where she worked as a cashier. The theft had occurred during Mrs. Thompson's 8-hour shift, and the vehicle had been missing for several hours before she discovered it was gone. The stolen vehicle report required detailed documentation of the car's description, license plate number, and any distinguishing features that might help patrol officers identify it if spotted during routine patrols. Officer Martinez also documented the circumstances of the theft, including the location where the vehicle had been parked and the time period during which the crime had occurred. Mrs. Thompson's Honda Accord was 15 years old and had a market value of approximately $3,000, making it an attractive target for thieves who sought older vehicles that were easier to steal and less likely to be equipped with modern anti-theft devices. The vehicle had been left unlocked with the keys hidden under the floor mat, a security practice that Mrs. Thompson had followed for years without incident. Officer Martinez's report noted that Mrs. Thompson used the vehicle to commute to work and to transport her elderly mother to medical appointments and grocery shopping trips. The theft had created transportation difficulties that extended beyond the financial loss, affecting Mrs. Thompson's ability to maintain her employment and care for her mother's needs. Night shift processing allowed Officer Martinez to coordinate with other law enforcement agencies about the stolen vehicle, entering its description into regional databases that would alert officers in surrounding jurisdictions to watch for the missing Honda. His report included information that would help investigators if the vehicle was recovered, including documentation of its condition and contents at the time of the theft. Across the Detective Bureau, Officer Lisa Williams was working through paperwork for a check fraud case that had been developing over several weeks as merchants throughout the city reported incidents involving forged checks bearing the same account information. The investigation had revealed a pattern of fraudulent activity that suggested organized criminal involvement rather than isolated incidents. The check fraud scheme involved stolen personal information that was being used to create counterfeit checks drawn on legitimate bank accounts belonging to victims who were unaware that their financial information had been compromised. The forged checks were being passed at grocery stores, restaurants, and other businesses that accepted checks as payment for goods and services. Officer Williams's night shift work involved analyzing the pattern of fraudulent check activity to identify commonalities that might lead to suspects or help prevent additional crimes. Her investigation had identified several businesses that had been targeted multiple times, suggesting that the perpetrators were familiar with local merchant practices and knew which establishments were most vulnerable to check fraud. Reports she was preparing would be shared with local banks and merchant associations to alert them about the fraudulent check scheme and provide guidance about verification procedures that could help prevent additional losses. Her documentation included examples of the forged checks and information about the methods being used to create convincing counterfeits. The station's night shift maintained its steady rhythm as officers worked through cases that represented the full spectrum of criminal activity affecting the community. Detective Robert Kim was processing reports from a series of vandalism incidents that had occurred at Roosevelt High School during the previous weekend. Crimes that had resulted in several thousand damage to school property. The vandalism had involved spray-painted messages on exterior walls, broken windows in the gymnasium, and damage to landscaping around the school's main entrance. Detective Kim's investigation had revealed that the crimes appeared to be the work of current or former students who were familiar with the school's layout and security procedures. His night shift documentation involved reviewing witness statements from school custodial staff who had discovered the damage and analyzing physical evidence that might help identify the perpetrators. The investigation had yielded fingerprint evidence and paint samples that could be compared with suspects if the case developed investigative leads. Detective Kim's report noted that the vandalism had occurred during a weekend when the school was hosting a basketball tournament, suggesting that the perpetrators had chosen a time when their activity might be concealed by the presence of legitimate visitors on school property. The timing indicated planning and forethought rather than spontaneous criminal behavior. The night shift processing required Detective Kim to coordinate with school administrators about security improvements that might prevent similar incidents, and with the district attorney's office about prosecution strategies if suspects were identified. His documentation would guide continued investigation and would support prosecution efforts if the case progressed to criminal charges. Officer Sarah Foster worked at her desk, completing paperwork for a shoplifting case that had resulted in the arrest of a teenage defendant who had been caught concealing merchandise at a downtown department store. The case required careful documentation because the defendant was a juvenile, necessitating special procedures and coordination with family court rather than the adult criminal justice system. The shoplifting incident had involved clothing and accessories worth approximately $150 that 17-year-old Marcus Washington had concealed in a backpack while shopping at Davidson's department store. Store security had observed the theft and had detained the teenager until police arrived to complete the arrest. Officer Foster's report documented not just the immediate facts of the shoplifting incident, but the circumstances that had led to the criminal behavior. Marcus Washington was a high school senior who worked part-time at a fast food restaurant and was saving money for college expenses. His parents had recently divorced, and financial pressures had made it difficult for the family to afford clothing and other necessities. The case would be handled through the juvenile justice system, which emphasized rehabilitation and family involvement rather than punishment. Officer Foster's documentation included information about Marcus Washington's school performance, employment history, and family circumstances that would help court officials develop an appropriate response to the criminal behavior. Her report noted that the teenager had been cooperative throughout the arrest process and had expressed genuine remorse for his actions. The store manager had indicated willingness to participate in a restitution agreement that would allow Marcus to work off the value of the stolen merchandise rather than pressing for formal prosecution. The night shift atmosphere encouraged the kind of careful, thoughtful documentation that cases like this required. Officer Foster had time to consider the broader circumstances that had contributed to the criminal behavior and to include recommendations about counseling and support services that might help prevent similar incidents in the future. Detective Thomas Miller was processing reports from a series of car break-ins that had occurred in the parking garage of the downtown shopping center during the previous week. The crimes had involved smashed windows and theft of items left visible in parked vehicles, following a pattern that suggested either a single perpetrator or a group working together. The car break-ins had affected 7 different vehicles over a 4-day period, with crimes occurring during both daytime and evening hours when the parking garage was busy with legitimate shoppers. The perpetrator appeared to target vehicles containing visible valuables such as purses, electronic devices, or shopping bags that might contain merchandise. Detective Miller's night shift analysis involved reviewing security camera footage from the parking garage and identifying patterns in the timing and location of the break-ins. His investigation had revealed that the crimes clustered around specific areas of the garage where security camera coverage was limited, and where the perpetrator could work without being easily observed. The report he was preparing included recommendations for improved security measures at the shopping center, including additional lighting, enhanced camera coverage, and modified patrol schedules that would make it more difficult for criminals to operate undetected. His documentation would be shared with shopping center management and with patrol officers who worked in the downtown area. As the night progressed, the Detective Bureau maintained its quiet efficiency as officers worked through the paperwork that transformed criminal incidents into permanent records. The night shift served a different function than daytime policing, focusing on the careful documentation and analysis that supported both immediate law enforcement needs and long-term crime prevention efforts. Officer Angela Rodriguez was completing reports for a domestic violence case that had resulted in arrest and criminal charges against a defendant who had assaulted his wife during an argument about child custody arrangements. The case required extensive documentation because it would proceed to prosecution and might eventually result in a restraining order or other legal remedies. The domestic violence incident had occurred at the Stevens residence on Oak Street when Robert Stevens had struck his estranged wife during a heated discussion about visitation schedules for their two young children. Mrs. Stevens had called police immediately after the assault and had been transported to the hospital for treatment of minor injuries. Officer Rodriguez's report documented the physical evidence of the assault, including photographs of Mrs. Stevens's injuries and statements from neighbors who had witnessed portions of the incident. The documentation would support prosecution efforts and would provide the court with information needed to make decisions about bail, restraining orders, and sentencing if the defendant was convicted. The case involved complex family dynamics that extended beyond the immediate criminal charges, including ongoing custody disputes and financial disagreements that had created ongoing tension between the parties. Officer Rodriguez's documentation included information about previous domestic disturbance calls from the same address and recommendations for counseling and support, services that might help address the underlying problems. Her night shift work involved coordinating with victim services organizations and with the district attorney's office about prosecution strategies and victim safety concerns. The documentation she created would guide continued law enforcement involvement and would support legal proceedings that might extend for months or years as the case worked through the court system. The station clock showed 3:30 a.m. as officers continued their steady work through cases that would become part of the permanent record documenting the community's ongoing struggle with crime and disorder. The night shift provided the time and quiet atmosphere needed for the careful documentation that supported both immediate law enforcement needs and long-term analysis of crime patterns and prevention strategies. Detective William Chang was reviewing files from a credit card fraud investigation that had involved coordination with federal authorities and financial institutions in multiple states. The case had begun with complaints from local merchants about suspicious transactions and had expanded into a complex investigation of organized criminal activity. The credit card fraud scheme had involved sophisticated equipment for manufacturing counterfeit cards and stolen personal information that had been used to create false identities for making fraudulent purchases. Detective Chang's investigation had required months of coordination with federal agencies and had ultimately resulted in the arrest of several defendants who were part of a larger criminal organization. His night shift documentation involved preparing final reports that summarized the investigation's findings and preserved the evidence that would support prosecution efforts in federal court. The case had demonstrated the complex nature of modern financial crimes and the need for coordination between local and federal law enforcement agencies. The paperwork that Detective Chang was completing would become part of the permanent record documenting how local police departments could effectively investigate and prosecute sophisticated financial crimes. His documentation would serve as a reference for future investigations and would contribute to the development of improved strategies for combating organized criminal activity. As dawn approached, the night shift officers completed their work and prepared to hand off active cases to the day crew. The paperwork they had processed during the overnight hours would become part of the permanent record, documenting criminal activity and police response with the careful attention to detail that characterized professional law enforcement work. The quiet efficiency of the night shift reflected the professionalism and dedication of officers who understood that careful documentation was as important as active investigation in maintaining community safety and supporting the criminal justice system. Their work during the overnight hours ensured that criminal cases could proceed through the legal system with the thorough documentation needed for successful prosecution and crime prevention efforts. The station prepared for another day of active policing as the night shift completed its work and departed for home. The reports they had processed would join thousands of others in the filing system that preserved the community's ongoing effort to understand and respond to criminal activity through professional law enforcement and careful documentation of every incident that disrupted neighborhood peace and individual security. Evidence technician Margaret Foster descended into the basement storage facility where thousands of case files rested in climate-controlled silence. Their contents preserved, but rarely disturbed except for the occasional legal appeal or academic research request. The fluorescent lights hummed softly as she made her way through rows of bankers' boxes, each one labeled with case numbers that had once commanded headlines, but now existed only as entries in the department's historical records. Box 1973 to 856 contained the photographic evidence from a bank robbery that had captivated the city's attention for 3 months. During the summer of that year, the images, now protected in acid-free sleeves, showed the interior of First National Bank on the morning after the crime had been discovered. What had once been scenes of dramatic violation had mellowed into documentary artifacts, their power to shock diminished by decades of careful storage and the gentle transformation. That time brought to all urgent things, the photographs, captured details that the investigating officers had considered crucial evidence 40 years earlier. Detective Raymond Murphy had documented every aspect of the crime scene with meticulous care, creating a visual record that preserved not just the facts of the robbery, but the atmosphere of disruption that had characterized the scene. The forced vault door, the scattered papers, the overturned furniture all appeared in black and white images that had acquired the patina of historical documentation. Margaret opened the accompanying case file and found Detective Murphy's handwritten reports, his careful block letters describing an investigation that had consumed 6 weeks of intensive police work. The bank robbery had netted the perpetrators approximately $12,000, a substantial sum in 1973, but one that would barely constitute a significant crime by contemporary standards. The investigation had involved coordination with federal authorities and had required sophisticated detective work to identify and apprehend the 3 suspects responsible. Case had been solved through patient police work rather than dramatic confrontation. Detective Murphy and his partner had followed a trail of evidence that led from the bank to a series of bars and restaurants where the robbers had spent their proceeds, eventually identifying witnesses who could place the suspects at the crime scene during the relevant time period. The arrests had been made quietly at the suspects' residences, without the high-speed chases or armed confrontations that characterized fictional portrayals of police work. Margaret continued through the box, finding photographs that documented the personal effects seized during the arrests. Clothing, jewelry, and small amounts of cash had been carefully cataloged and preserved as evidence, each item tagged with meticulous attention to chain of custody requirements. The photograph showed these ordinary objects laid out on tables in the evidence processing room, transformed by their connection to criminal activity into pieces of a legal puzzle that would be reassembled during prosecution. The suspects in the bank robbery case had been unremarkable individuals whose photographs showed them to be young men in their 20s, their faces displaying the kind of ordinary features that would have allowed them to blend into any crowd. Richard Collins, age 24, had worked intermittent construction and had no significant criminal history prior to the bank robbery. Thomas Rivera, 26, had been employed at a local factory until being laid off 3 months before the crime. Michael Foster, 23, had been attending community college part-time. While working at a gas station, the case file contained detailed background investigations that revealed how 3 unremarkable young men had decided to commit what they apparently saw as a single significant crime that would solve their individual financial problems. Their planning had been crude but effective, involving surveillance of the bank's routines and the acquisition of weapons that they had never intended to use for violence. The robbery had been completed without injury to anyone, though the psychological impact on bank employees had been significant and lasting. Detective Murphy's reports captured the methodical nature of the investigation that had led to the suspects' identification and arrest. The detective had interviewed dozens of potential witnesses, reviewed hours of security footage from businesses near the bank, and coordinated with federal investigators who had jurisdiction over bank robberies. The case had required patient attention to detail rather than dramatic detective work, the kind of systematic investigation that characterized most successful police work. Margaret moved to another section of the storage area where cases from the early 1980s were preserved in similar bankers' boxes. Box 19822234 contained evidence from a series of convenience store robberies that had occurred over a 6-month period. Crimes that had followed a consistent pattern but had required extensive investigation to link definitively to a single perpetrator. Photographs from these cases showed the modest interiors of neighborhood stores that had served working-class communities throughout the city. Murphy's Corner Store, Jackson's Market, Chun's Grocery, and half a dozen similar establishments had been targeted by someone who appeared to be familiar with their operations and customer patterns. The crime scene photographs captured the aftermath of robberies that had netted small amounts of cash but had created lasting fear among store owners and their customers. Detective Patricia Williams had investigated the convenience store robberies, and her reports filled several thick folders within the case box. Each robbery had been documented with careful attention to the perpetrator's methods and the evidence left behind at each scene. The detective had identified similarities in timing, approach, and behavior that suggested a single individual was responsible for all the crimes. The investigation had revealed that the robber followed a consistent pattern of entering stores during evening hours, when only one employee was present, displaying a handgun to compel cooperation, and taking only cash from the register while leaving other valuable merchandise untouched. The perpetrator had spoken quietly and politely during each robbery, creating an atmosphere that was threatening but not violent, leaving victims shaken but physically unharmed. Detective Williams had eventually solved the case by identifying a pattern in the geographic distribution of the robberies that suggested someone who lived or worked in the central part of the city and was familiar with the surrounding neighborhoods. Her investigation had focused on individuals with access to information about store operations and had ultimately led to the arrest of a part-time security guard who had used his knowledge of various businesses to select targets and plan his approach. Margaret found the suspect's photograph in the case file, showing a thin young man with unremarkable features who appeared more nervous than dangerous. Kevin Patterson, age 28, had been working irregular hours as a security guard for a company that provided services to several of the businesses he had robbed. His access to information about store procedures and schedules had enabled him to select times when the robberies were most likely to succeed without detection. The case had been resolved without violence or dramatic confrontation. Detective Williams had arrested Patterson at his apartment on a quiet Sunday morning, finding evidence that linked him to several of the robberies. The suspect had cooperated with the investigation and had expressed remorse for crimes that he attributed to gambling, debts and financial pressures that had overwhelmed his ability to cope through legitimate means. Margaret continued her survey of the historical cases, moving through decades of criminal investigations that had once commanded urgent attention but now rested quietly in their archival storage. Box 1979 to 445 contained evidence from a burglary ring that had operated throughout the residential neighborhoods on the city's west side. Crimes that had affected dozens of families over an 8-month period. Photographs from this investigation showed the interiors of homes that had been systematically searched by burglars who had demonstrated knowledge of where valuable items were typically kept. The crime scene images captured the careful disruption that characterized these break-ins, with furniture moved and drawers searched but property damage kept to a minimum. The burglars had been professional in their approach, taking valuable items while avoiding destruction that might have increased their legal exposure if apprehended. Detective Robert Chang had led the investigation into the burglary ring, coordinating with patrol officers and community members to identify patterns in the crimes and develop strategies for apprehending the perpetrators. His reports documented a methodical investigation that had required analysis of crime timing, geographic patterns, and the types of property being targeted. The burglary ring had consisted of 4 individuals who had developed an efficient system for identifying target homes, gaining entry without detection, and disposing of stolen property through a network of receivers who operated pawn shops and used merchandise stores. The investigation had required coordination with investigators in neighboring jurisdictions where similar crimes had been occurring, ultimately revealing a criminal enterprise that had operated across municipal boundaries. Detective Chang's investigation had been complicated by the sophistication of the burglary operation and the careful planning that had characterized each crime. The perpetrators had conducted surveillance of target neighborhoods, identifying homes where residents followed predictable schedules that left properties unguarded during specific time periods. They had used stolen vehicles for transportation and had developed methods for defeating common security measures without leaving obvious evidence of their presence. The case had been solved through patient police work and community cooperation, rather than dramatic detective work. Detective Chang had worked with neighborhood residents to identify suspicious activity and had coordinated with pawn shop operators to trace stolen property. The investigation had ultimately led to arrests that had been made quietly and without incident, ending a crime spree that had affected hundreds of families but had never involved violence or direct confrontation. Margaret opened box 1985 to 167, which contained evidence from a check fraud investigation that had involved a sophisticated scheme to steal personal information and create counterfeit checks that were passed at businesses throughout the metropolitan area. The case had required coordination with federal authorities and had revealed the complexity of financial crimes that were becoming more common as technology made counterfeiting easier and more profitable. Photographs in this case showed examples of the forged checks that had been used in the fraud scheme, along with the equipment that had been seized during arrest of the perpetrators. The investigation had revealed a criminal operation that had involved stolen mail, sophisticated printing equipment, and detailed knowledge of banking procedures that had enabled the fraud to continue undetected for several months. Detective Jennifer Martinez had led the investigation into the check fraud scheme, working with bank security officers and federal investigators to trace the source of the counterfeit checks and identify the individuals responsible for the crimes. Her reports documented a complex investigation that had required analysis of banking records, coordination with postal authorities, and surveillance operations that had ultimately led to arrests. Check fraud scheme had affected dozens of businesses and individual victims whose personal information had been compromised through mail theft and other means. The investigation had revealed how criminals had used legitimate appearing checks to purchase merchandise and obtain cash, creating losses that totaled several $100,000. Before this scheme was discovered and stopped, Detective Martinez's investigation had demonstrated the challenges that law enforcement faced in addressing financial crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries and involved sophisticated criminal techniques. The case had required months of careful investigation and had ultimately resulted in federal prosecution of the main organizers. Though some participants had never been identified or apprehended, Margaret moved through additional storage areas where cases from the 1990s were preserved in similar fashion. Box 1994 to 289 contained evidence from a series of car thefts that had targeted specific makes and models of vehicles that were popular with younger buyers. The investigation had revealed a criminal operation that had involved stealing cars for resale in other states, requiring coordination with law enforcement agencies across the region. The photographs from this investigation showed the organized nature of the car theft operation, with evidence of sophisticated techniques for defeating anti-theft systems and modifying stolen vehicles to conceal their origins. Detective William Park had led the investigation, working with auto theft specialists and federal investigators to identify the criminal network and trace stolen vehicles to their ultimate destinations. The car theft ring had operated with considerable sophistication, targeting specific vehicles that were in demand in markets outside the region where they were stolen. The investigation had revealed how stolen cars were transported to other states where they were sold to unsuspecting buyers or used for parts in legitimate appearing auto repair businesses. Detective Park's investigation had required surveillance operations, undercover work, and coordination with investigators in multiple states to map the criminal network and identify all participants. The case had ultimately resulted in numerous arrests and had disrupted a criminal operation that had been responsible for hundreds of vehicle thefts over a 2-year period. As Margaret continued her survey of the archived cases, she found herself struck by how crimes that had once generated newspaper headlines and community concern had been transformed by time into historical artifacts. The photographs that had once shocked and outraged now appeared as documentary evidence of how the community had dealt with criminal activity during different periods of its development. Box 19884456 contained evidence from a vandalism case that had involved extensive damage to public property during a period when the city was experiencing economic difficulties and social tensions. The photographs showed graffiti and property damage that had required significant resources to repair, but the images now appeared as documentation of a community's struggle with social problems that had been addressed through a combination of law enforcement and social programs. Detective Michael Foster had investigated the vandalism case, working with community leaders and social service agencies to address the underlying problems that had contributed to the criminal activity. His reports documented not just the crimes, but the community response that had involved job training programs, youth activities, and neighborhood improvement projects that had helped address the social conditions that had contributed to the problem. The vandalism investigation had revealed how criminal activity often reflected broader social problems that required community-wide responses rather than simple law enforcement solutions. Detective Foster's work had contributed to programs that had reduced crime while also addressing education, employment, and recreation needs that had been identified as contributing factors in criminal behavior. Margaret concluded her survey of the archived cases as the afternoon light began to fade in the small windows that provided the storage area's only natural illumination. The thousands of case files that surrounded her represented decades of police work and community struggle with criminal activity. Each investigation preserved as part of the historical record that documented how the city had evolved and adapted to changing social conditions. The photographs and reports that had once commanded urgent attention now rested quietly in their climate-controlled environment, available for researchers and legal professionals who might need access to historical information but no longer carrying the emotional impact that had characterized their original documentation. Time had transformed urgent investigations into historical artifacts, but it had also preserved the careful work of generations of police officers who had served their community with professionalism and dedication. The archived cases represented more than just criminal investigations. They documented the evolution of police work, the development of investigative techniques, and the changing nature of criminal activity as technology and social conditions had evolved over decades. Each case preserved not just the facts of individual crimes, but the methods and approaches that had characterized law enforcement during different periods of the community's history. As Margaret prepared to leave the storage area, she reflected on how the archived cases demonstrated the continuity of police work across generations of officers who had faced similar challenges in maintaining community safety and order. The methods had evolved and technology had advanced, but the fundamental principles of careful investigation, thorough documentation, and professional service had remained constant throughout the decades represented in these files. The storage area returned to its quiet vigil as Margaret turned off the lights and secured the facility for the night. The thousands of case files would continue their patient wait for the next researcher or legal inquiry, preserving their memories of crimes and investigations that had once commanded community attention but now rested peacefully in the gentle embrace of historical documentation. Detective Sarah Chun walked slowly along Riverside Avenue during her evening patrol, observing how the familiar streets had become repositories of forgotten stories, each intersection and building holding layers of history that only longtime residents and veteran officers could read in the subtle signs that remained visible to those who knew how to look. The city itself had become an archive of memory, preserving evidence of crimes and investigations in the physical landscape where they had occurred decades earlier. The old Brennan's hardware store on Main Street still bore the faint outline of security bars that had been installed after a series of break-ins. During the winter of 1987, the bars had been removed. Years later, when the crime problems that had prompted their installation had been resolved through improved lighting and increased police patrols, but the mounting holes remained visible in the brick facade for those who remembered when the downtown area had struggled with property crimes that had affected nearly every business district. Establishment. Detective Chun remembered reading the case files that documented the downtown burglary series, crimes that had been investigated by Detective Robert Murphy during a period when economic pressures had created social tensions that manifested in increased criminal activity. The investigation had required months of patient police work and community cooperation, ultimately leading to arrests that had ended the crime spree and allowed business owners to remove the defensive measures that had made the downtown area feel unwelcoming to customers and visitors. The hardware store had been owned by Patrick Brennan, whose father had established the business in 1953 and had operated it as a community gathering place where residents had come, not just to purchase tools and supplies, but to discuss neighborhood issues, and share information about local concerns. The burglaries had violated more than just property rights, disrupting the sense of community trust that had made the store an unofficial social center for the surrounding neighborhoods. Chun continued her patrol through the downtown area, noting how various buildings and locations contained similar memories of criminal activity that had been resolved through professional police work and community involvement. The old First National Bank building on the corner of Main and 3rd Street had been the site of a robbery in 1973 that had required coordination with federal authorities and had resulted in arrests that had made headlines. For several weeks, the bank robbery had been investigated by Detective Raymond Kowalski, whose methodical approach had led to the identification and arrest of 3 suspects who had planned the crime for several months before executing it during the busy lunch hour when the bank was crowded with customers conducting routine business. The investigation had demonstrated how careful police work could solve complex crimes without the dramatic confrontations that characterized fictional portrayals of law enforcement. Bank building now housed a small restaurant whose owners were probably unaware of its connection to criminal history that had been documented in police files and newspaper archives, but had faded from community memory as newer concerns had replaced older ones. The physical space had been transformed by renovation and new purposes, but the investigation records preserved the professional work that had been done to maintain community safety during an earlier era. Chun's patrol route took her past the Riverside Bridge, where maintenance crews had recently repainted the railings, without knowing that they were covering evidence of a vandalism incident from 1985 that had involved dozens of teenagers who had gathered for an impromptu party that had escalated into property damage and public disturbance. Calls that had required careful police intervention to resolve without arrests or long-term consequences. Detective Jennifer Martinez had handled the bridge incident, working with community leaders and school administrators to address the underlying social issues that had contributed to the gathering and the property damage that had resulted from unsupervised teenage activity. Her investigation had led to the development of alternative recreational programs that had provided positive outlets for young people's energy while reducing the likelihood of similar incidents in the future. Bridge renovation had erased the physical evidence of the vandalism, but the social programs that had been developed in response to the incident continued to serve the community's young people, providing recreational activities and educational opportunities that addressed needs that had been identified through Detective Martinez's comprehensive investigation. The bridge had been restored to its original appearance, but the community had been strengthened through programs that had grown out of understanding the social dynamics that had contributed to the criminal activity. Detective Chun continued across the Cape Bridge into the residential neighborhoods where older homes contained their own layers of criminal history that were visible only to those who knew what to look for. The Victorian house on Elm Street had been burglarized 3 times during the summer of 1979. Crimes that had been investigated by Detective William Chang and had ultimately been solved through neighborhood cooperation and careful analysis of crime patterns that had revealed the perpetrator's methods and schedule. The burglaries had been committed by a teenager who had been familiar with the neighborhood's patterns of activity and had known when specific houses were likely to be unoccupied. Detective Chang's investigation had involved extensive interviews with neighbors and analysis of the timing and methods used in each break-in, ultimately leading to identification of the suspect through careful police work rather than dramatic detective techniques. The Victorian house now showed no external evidence of its connection to criminal activity from decades earlier. The current owners had installed modern security systems and had landscaped the property in ways that improved natural surveillance from the street, changes that reflected contemporary crime prevention principles, but had been made for aesthetic reasons rather than security concerns. Chun's patrol included the apartment complex on Oak Street, where a domestic violence incident in 1992 had led to significant changes in how local police responded to family conflicts. The incident had been investigated by Detective Patricia Williams, whose thorough documentation had revealed patterns of escalating violence that had prompted development of new protocols for protecting victims and holding perpetrators accountable for their actions. The domestic violence case had involved a family whose conflicts had been reported to police on several previous occasions but had never resulted in arrests or formal intervention until the situation had escalated to serious physical violence that had required hospitalization of the victim. Detective Williams's investigation had documented how the criminal justice system's previous responses had been inadequate to protect family members or address the underlying problems that had contributed to the violence. The apartment complex had since implemented policies for responding to domestic disturbances that included coordination with social service agencies and victim advocacy organizations. The changes had been made without publicity or community recognition, but they had created safer environments for residents who might otherwise have been vulnerable to domestic violence that could escalate without appropriate intervention. Detective Chun's patrol continued through neighborhoods where street corners and business locations held similar memories of criminal investigations that had shaped community responses to safety concerns. The corner of 5th and Maple had been the site of a drug-dealing operation in 1988 that had been investigated by Detective Michael Foster through patient surveillance and community cooperation that had ultimately led to arrests and prosecution of several individuals who had been disrupting neighborhood peace. The drug-dealing investigation had required months of careful police work to identify all participants in the criminal operation and gather evidence that would support successful prosecution. Detective Foster had worked closely with community residents who had provided information about suspicious activity while maintaining their anonymity to protect them from retaliation by criminal associates. The corner now appeared to be a typical residential intersection with no obvious signs of its connection to criminal activity from previous decades. The community cooperation that had been essential to solving the drug-dealing case had continued in the form of informal neighborhood watch activities that had helped prevent similar problems from developing in subsequent years. Chun observed how the physical landscape of the city contained countless such memories of criminal investigations that had been resolved through professional police work and community involvement. Each neighborhood held stories of crimes that had been solved through patient investigation rather than dramatic confrontation, leaving behind improved security measures and stronger community relationships that continued to benefit residents long after the specific criminal problems had been addressed. The elementary school playground on Riverside Drive had been the site of a vandalism incident in 1984 that had involved damage to equipment and buildings that had required several $1,000s in repairs. Detective Robert Kim had investigated the case, working with school administrators and community volunteers to identify the perpetrators and develop prevention strategies that had reduced similar incidents in subsequent years. The vandalism investigation had revealed that the property damage had been committed by students who had been experiencing social and academic pressures that had led them to act out in destructive ways. Detective Kim's investigation had led to counseling and support services for the students involved, addressing underlying problems while also holding them accountable for the damage they had caused. The playground had been repaired and updated several times since the vandalism incident, but the support programs that had been developed in response to Detective Kim's investigation had continued to serve students who experienced similar pressures. The school had maintained its commitment to addressing social and emotional needs alongside academic instruction, creating an environment that reduced the likelihood of criminal behavior by students who might otherwise have lacked appropriate outlets for their frustrations. Detective Chun's patrol included commercial areas where businesses had adapted to criminal activity through security measures that were now so commonplace that their origins and specific criminal incidents had been forgotten by most community members. The grocery store on 3rd Street had installed security cameras in 1986, following a series of shoplifting incidents that had been investigated by Detective Lisa Williams and had resulted in changes to store layout and employee training that had reduced theft while maintaining a welcoming atmosphere for customers. The shoplifting investigation had revealed that most incidents had been committed by individuals who were experiencing financial hardship rather than professional criminals who were stealing for profit. Detective Williams had worked with store management and social service agencies to address underlying economic problems while also implementing security measures that deterred criminal activity without creating an unwelcoming environment for legitimate customers. The security cameras had become standard equipment in retail establishments throughout the community, but their installation had originally been prompted by specific criminal investigations that had demonstrated their effectiveness in both preventing and solving property crimes. The grocery store had maintained its community-oriented approach while implementing reasonable security measures that protected both merchandise and customers. Chun continued her patrol through residential areas where individual houses contained their own connections to criminal investigations that had shaped community responses to safety concerns. The ranch-style house on Cedar Street had been the target of a burglary in 1983 that had been investigated by Detective Thomas Miller and had led to identification of a suspect who had been responsible for similar crimes throughout the neighborhood. The burglary had been solved through careful analysis of crime patterns and coordination with patrol officers who had increased their presence in affected neighborhoods. Detective Miller's investigation had demonstrated how residential crimes could be prevented through community awareness and appropriate security measures that addressed common vulnerabilities without creating fortress-like environments that detracted from neighborhood character. The house on Cedar Street now appeared similar to neighboring homes, except for security features that reflected contemporary crime prevention principles. The current owners had probably made these improvements for general safety reasons, rather than specific knowledge of the property's connection to criminal activity from previous decades. But their choices had been influenced by community standards that had evolved partly in response to earlier criminal investigations. Detective Chun's patrol concluded as evening settled over neighborhoods that held their memories quietly, each street and building containing layers of history that documented the community's ongoing struggle with criminal activity and its success in criminal activity and its success in criminal activity and its success. Maintaining safety through professional law enforcement and community cooperation. The physical landscape had been shaped by countless criminal investigations that had been resolved through patient police work rather than dramatic confrontation. The city itself had become an archive of memory, preserving evidence of how communities could address criminal problems through cooperation between law enforcement, professionals, and residents who were committed to maintaining safe neighborhoods for themselves and their families. Each generation had built upon the work of previous ones, creating a legacy of community safety that was visible in the physical improvements and social programs that had grown out of specific criminal investigations. The streets and buildings that Detective Chun had observed during her patrol would continue to hold their memories quietly, preserving evidence of professional police work and community cooperation that had addressed criminal problems while strengthening social relationships and institutions. The archive of memory that was embedded in the city's geography would remain, available to those who knew how to read the subtle signs that marked places where crimes had been solved and communities had been strengthened through shared commitment to safety and mutual support. As night settled over the neighborhoods, the city's archive of memory settled into its quiet vigil, holding stories of criminal investigations and community responses that had shaped the physical and social landscape over decades of professional law enforcement and civic cooperation. The memories would remain preserved in the geography of the community, available to remind future generations of how previous ones had faced similar challenges and had succeeded in maintaining safety through dedication to professional principles and community values. The final transfer of case files to permanent storage occurred on a Thursday afternoon in late autumn, when Records Supervisor Helen Morrison oversaw the careful placement of the last active investigations from 1995 into the climate-controlled archive that would preserve them for the legally required retention period, before they too would join the thousands of cases that had already completed their journey from urgent investigation to historical documentation. The process moved with ceremonial slowness, each box labeled and shelved according to procedures that had been refined over decades of archival practice. Case 1995 to 8847. The final file to be transferred concerned a check fraud investigation that had been resolved through patient detective work and coordination with banking institutions across 3 states. Detective Patricia Chun had closed the case 6 months earlier, and now her careful documentation would take its place among the permanent records that preserve the community's ongoing struggle with criminal activity. Helen Morrison walked through the archive's newest section, observing how the cases from 1995 filled the last remaining spaces in storage areas that had been constructed to accommodate exactly this volume of documentation. The systematic organization reflected decades of experience with record retention requirements and the practical needs of legal professionals who might need to access historical case information for appeals, background investigations, or academic research purposes. The transition from active investigation to permanent storage marked a fundamental change in how these crimes would be remembered by the community and the PUFO-EVA criminal justice system. Cases that had once demanded immediate attention from detectives, prosecutors, and court personnel would now rest quietly in their archival containers, available for reference but no longer part of the daily business of law enforcement and legal proceedings. Box 1995-234 contained the final documentation from a burglary investigation that had affected 17 homes in the West Side neighborhood during the summer months. Detective Michael Rodriguez had solved the case through careful analysis of crime patterns and community cooperation that had led to the identification and arrest of 2 teenagers who had been responsible for the break-ins while school was not in session. The investigation had demonstrated how professional police work could address property crimes without resorting to heavy-handed enforcement tactics that might have damaged relationships between law enforcement and community residents. Detective Rodriguez had worked with neighborhood leaders and social service agencies to ensure that the arrested juveniles received appropriate counseling and supervision, while also providing restitution to victims whose property had been damaged or stolen. The burglary case had been resolved in ways that strengthened rather than strained community relationships, creating precedents for how similar cases would be handled in future years. The documentation preserved in the permanent archive would be available to guide future investigations, while also serving as evidence of how communities could address criminal problems through cooperation between professional law enforcement and engaged citizens. Helen Morrison continued through the storage areas where decades of criminal investigations rested in ordered silence, each section representing years of police work that had been completed and filed according to established procedures. The archive contained more than just legal documentation. It preserved the institutional memory of how the community had evolved its responses to criminal activity over time, learning from experience and adapting methods to address changing social conditions. The section containing cases from the 1980s held investigations that had established precedents for contemporary police work, documenting techniques and approaches that had been developed through experience and had proven effective in maintaining community safety while respecting individual rights. Detective William Chang's domestic violence investigations from that era had led to protocols that continued to guide police responses to family conflicts, while Detective Jennifer Martinez's financial crime work had established procedures for coordinating with federal authorities on complex fraud cases. These archived investigations represented more than just completed police work. They documented the evolution of law enforcement practices and the development of community-oriented approaches that had proven more effective than purely punitive responses to criminal behavior. The archive preserved not just the facts of individual crimes, but the wisdom that had been gained through decades of professional experience and community engagement. Helen Morrison paused at the section containing cases from the 1970s, where the oldest investigations in the current archive had begun their transition from recent history to historical artifact. The storage containers in this section showed the slight discoloration that indicated decades of careful preservation, but their contents remained accessible to researchers and legal professionals who might need to examine historical patterns of criminal activity or law enforcement responses. Case 1975 to 1023 had been one of Detective Raymond Murphy's most complex investigations, involving a sophisticated burglary ring that had operated across municipal boundaries and had required months of coordination with law enforcement agencies in neighboring jurisdictions. The case had been solved through patient police work and had resulted in arrests that had disrupted a criminal organization responsible for hundreds of property crimes over a 2-year period. Detective Murphy's investigation had established procedures for interagency cooperation that continued to guide contemporary law enforcement responses to organized criminal activity. His careful documentation had preserved not just the facts of the specific case, but the investigative methods that had proven effective in addressing complex crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. The archive's organizational system reflected the understanding that criminal investigations generated knowledge that extended far beyond the immediate resolution of specific cases. Each investigation contributed to the body of professional expertise that guided future police work, creating an institutional memory that helped each generation of officers build upon the experience of their predecessors. Helen Morrison observed how the archive's atmosphere encouraged reflection on the nature of police work and its role in maintaining community safety and social order. The quiet environment and systematic organization created space for contemplating how individual investigations contributed to broader patterns of criminal justice and community development that extended across decades of social change. The storage area maintained perfect climate control that would preserve the documentary evidence for the full retention period required by law, ensuring that future researchers would have access to complete records of how the community had addressed criminal activity during different periods of its history. The careful preservation reflected recognition that these investigations documented not just criminal behavior but community responses that had shaped social institutions and legal procedures. As afternoon light filtered through the archives, small windows, Helen Morrison completed her final inspection of the newly stored cases and prepared to update the tracking systems that monitored the location and status of every investigation in the permanent collection. The database that recorded this information would enable future researchers to locate specific cases and would ensure that legal professionals could access historical documentation when needed for appeals or background investigations. The computerized tracking system represented a modern addition to archival procedures that had been developed over decades. of experience with large-scale document storage and retrieval. The combination of traditional filing methods and contemporary database technology ensured that the archive would remain accessible to authorized users while maintaining the security and preservation standards required for legal documentation. Helen Morrison's work in the archive connected her to generations of records professionals who had understood their role in preserving the institutional memory of law enforcement and criminal justice. The careful organization and preservation of these case files ensured that the professional knowledge gained through decades of police work would remain available to guide future investigators and inform academic research about crime patterns and law enforcement effectiveness. The archive served multiple purposes that extended beyond simple storage of legal documents. It preserved evidence of how communities had evolved their responses to criminal activity, documented the development of investigative techniques and legal procedures, and maintained records that could be analyzed to understand long-term trends in criminal behavior and law enforcement effectiveness. As evening approached, the archive prepared for its nightly rest, with security systems activating to protect the thousands of case files that contained the community's documented struggle with criminal activity. The climate control systems would maintain perfect environmental conditions throughout the night, ensuring that the documentary evidence would remain preserved for future generations who might need to understand how their predecessors had faced similar challenges. The building's security protocols reflected the recognition that these archived investigations contained sensitive information that required protection from unauthorized access while remaining available to legitimate researchers and legal professionals. The balance between security and accessibility had been carefully calibrated to serve both preservation and research needs while respecting privacy rights and legal restrictions. Helen Morrison completed her final tasks and prepared to leave the archive to its quiet vigil, confident that the systematic organization and careful preservation would ensure that decades of professional police work would remain available to guide future law enforcement efforts and inform scholarly research about crime and criminal justice. The archive would continue its patient work of preservation throughout the night and in the years to come. The storage facility settled into its evening quiet as the last staff member departed, leaving thousands of case files to rest in their climate-controlled environment. The investigations that had once commanded urgent attention from detectives, prosecutors, and court personnel now waited silently for the occasional researcher or legal inquiry that might disturb their peaceful existence in the archival collection. Each case file contained not just the documentation of criminal activity and police response, but evidence of human beings struggling with social problems that had manifested in criminal behavior. The investigations preserved in the archive had addressed not just individual crimes, but community-wide issues that had required cooperation between law enforcement professionals and engaged citizens working together to maintain neighborhood safety and social order. The archive held memories of thousands of investigations that had been resolved through professional police work rather than dramatic confrontation, documenting how communities could address criminal problems through patient investigation, community cooperation, and commitment to both individual rights and collective safety. Each case had contributed to the body of professional knowledge that guided contemporary law enforcement while also strengthening social institutions and community relationships. As night deepened around the storage facility, the archived investigations settled into their eternal rest, preserved against time and environmental damage, but no longer part of the active struggle against criminal activity. They had completed their journey from urgent investigation to historical documentation, taking their place among the thousands of cases that documented how previous generations had faced similar challenges and had succeeded in maintaining community safety through professional dedication and civic cooperation. The archive breathed quietly in its climate-controlled environment, holding its secrets close while remaining, always ready to share them with those who might need access to the institutional memory that had been preserved through decades of careful documentation and systematic organization. The cases would remain available for as long as legal requirements and historical interest might demand, serving as testimony to the professional work that had been done to maintain community safety and social order. In the deepest quiet of the night, the archive maintained its vigil over thousands of completed investigations, each one representing hours of professional work by dedicated officers who had understood their responsibility to serve their community through careful investigation and thorough documentation. The cases rested peacefully in their ordered arrangement, their urgent demands transformed into gentle memories that would inspire future generations of law enforcement professionals. The final silence settled over the storage facility as the building completed its transition from day to night, with security systems maintaining watch over the archived investigations that had found their rest in the careful preservation of institutional memory. The crimes had become whispers. The investigations had settled into the gentle rhythm of historical documentation, and all stories had found their peace in the quiet chambers where memory was preserved against the passage of time. The archive would continue its patient work through the night and in all the nights to come, holding fast to the evidence of how communities could address criminal problems through professional dedication and civic cooperation, preserving for future generations the wisdom that had been gained through decades of experience with the eternal human struggle between order and disorder, safety and danger, hope and fear. And in that preservation, in that quiet holding of memory and wisdom, the archive fulfilled its highest purpose, ensuring that the knowledge gained through struggle would not be lost, that the lessons learned through experience would remain available to guide future efforts, and that the professional dedication of generations of law enforcement officers would continue to inspire those who would carry forward the work of maintaining community safety and social order. The stories found their rest, the cases sealed themselves in silence, and the archive embraced them all with the gentle peace that comes to all urgent things when their time of action has passed and their time of memory has begun. The sub-basement beneath the main archive had been discovered only recently, during renovation work that had revealed a forgotten storage area dating to the building's original construction in 1952. Archivist Dr. Elena Vasquez descended the narrow staircase with a single flashlight, exploring spaces that had been sealed for decades and contained records that predated the current filing system by generations. The air carried a different quality than the climate-controlled archive above, heavy with the weight of absolute stillness and the accumulated silence of records that had been forgotten even by the institution that had created them. These were the cases from before standardized procedures, before systematic organization, before the careful protocols that had transformed police work into the professional discipline that contemporary officers practiced. The wooden filing cabinets in this forgotten chamber bore no resemblance to the metal storage systems that housed more recent investigations, hand-carved from oak and fitted with brass hardware that had tarnished to a deep patina. They represented an era when record-keeping was viewed as craft rather than administrative necessity. Each drawer opened with the whispered protest of wood that had swelled and contracted through decades of temperature changes. File 1947-012 rested in the first drawer Dr. Vasquez opened, its manila folder brown with age and its typewritten pages so faded that the words appeared more as suggestions than statements. The case concerned a missing bicycle that had belonged to 8-year-old Timothy Morrison, who had left it outside Henley's General Store while purchasing penny candy and had returned to find it gone. Officer Patrick Sullivan had investigated the bicycle theft with the same methodical attention that contemporary detectives brought to major felonies. His handwritten report composed in fountain pen ink that had faded to sepia, documented interviews with store customers, examination of the area where the bicycle had been left, and canvassing of nearby neighborhoods where it might have been taken by someone seeking transportation. The investigation had been resolved when Mrs. Dorothy Chun noticed an unfamiliar bicycle in her neighbor's yard and had mentioned it to Officer Sullivan during his door-to-door inquiries. The bicycle had been taken by 12-year-old Robert Kim, who had been walking home from the library and had succumbed to the temptation of an unguarded bicycle when his own transportation plans had fallen through. Officer Sullivan's report noted that young Robert had been genuinely remorseful for his impulsive action and had immediately returned the bicycle to Timothy Morrison with a sincere apology. The case had been resolved without formal charges, with Robert's parents ensuring that their son understood the seriousness of taking someone else's property and arranging for him to perform yard work for the Morrison family as restitution for his mistake. Dr. Vasquez found herself drawn to the gentle humanity that characterized these earliest police records, when officers had functioned more as community-aiders than law enforcers, and when investigations had focused on restoring relationships rather than simply punishing violations. The reports preserved not just facts but the social fabric of a smaller community where everyone knew their neighbors and where criminal activity was viewed as disruption to be healed rather than evil to be punished. File 1948087 contained the investigation of a series of missing pies that had been cooling on windowsills throughout the Riverside neighborhood. During the late summer harvest season, Mrs. Elizabeth Murphy had been the first to report the theft, discovering that an apple pie she had placed on her kitchen windowsill had vanished while she was tending her garden in the backyard. Detective James Chun had approached the pie thefts with the systematic methodology that characterized all professional police work, regardless of the apparent triviality of the crimes involved. His investigation had revealed a pattern of thefts that occurred during afternoon hours, when homemakers traditionally placed baked goods near open windows to cool in the breeze that came off the river. The detective's patient work had eventually identified the perpetrator as Mr. Frank Kowalski, a widower in his 70s who had been struggling with loneliness and hunger since his wife's death the previous winter. The pie thefts had not been motivated by criminal intent, but by the combination of financial hardship and the overwhelming grief that had made him unable to care for himself properly. Detective Chun's report documented how the community had responded to the discovery with compassion rather than prosecution demands. The neighborhood women had organized a meal delivery system for Mr. Kowalski, and several families had included him in their dinner invitations, addressing the underlying social isolation that had contributed to his desperate actions. The case had been marked closed without charges, but its resolution had led to the establishment of informal support networks that had helped other elderly residents who were struggling with similar challenges. The pie thefts had revealed community needs that had been addressed through cooperation and mutual aid rather than criminal justice procedures. Dr. Vasquez continued through the forgotten files, finding case after case that demonstrated how policing had once been understood as community service in the most literal sense. These investigations had addressed not just criminal behavior, but the social conditions that contributed to it, with officers functioning as social workers, mediators, and community organizers as much as law enforcers. File 1949 to 156 documented an investigation into repeated complaints about loud music coming from the boarding house on Elm Street, where young men who worked at the railroad yard had gathered for evening card games that had extended well into the night hours when neighboring families were trying to sleep. Officer Michael Rodriguez had addressed the noise complaints by visiting the boarding house and speaking with both the residents and their neighbors about finding solutions that would allow the card games to continue without disturbing others. His investigation had revealed that the young railroad workers had few other recreational opportunities and that the card games provided important social connections for men who were far from their families and home communities. The resolution had involved moving the card games to the boarding house's basement and installing sound insulation that reduced noise transmission to neighboring properties. The railroad company had contributed to the cost of the improvements, recognizing that worker morale and community relations were important considerations for their business operations. Officer Rodriguez's report preserved not just the facts of the noise complaints but the collaborative process that had led to a solution satisfying all parties. The investigation had strengthened rather than strained community relationships, creating precedents for addressing similar conflicts through cooperation rather than enforcement. The sub-basement archive contained hundreds of such cases, each one documenting how police officers had understood their role as community problem solvers rather than simply law enforcers. These investigations had addressed the full spectrum of human conflict and social disruption, from serious crimes to minor disputes that threaten neighborhood harmony. Dr. Vasquez found file 1950-234, which documented a theft at Morrison's Bakery that had initially appeared to be a straightforward criminal case but had revealed complex social dynamics that had required careful investigation and sensitive resolution. Someone had been entering the bakery during early morning hours and taking bread and pastries, leaving behind small amounts of money that were insufficient to cover the full cost of the stolen items. Detective William Park had approached the bakery thefts as a puzzle to be solved rather than simply a crime to be punished. His investigation had involved careful observation of the bakery's routines and interviews with neighbors who might have noticed unusual activity during the early morning hours when the thefts were occurring. The detective's patient work had revealed that the perpetrator was Mrs. Sarah Kim, a widow with 3 young children who had been struggling to feed her family since her husband's death in an industrial accident. She had been taking bread and pastries to supplement her children's diet while leaving what money she could afford as partial payment for the food. Detective Park's report documented how the community had responded to the discovery by organizing support for Mrs. Kim and her children, including employment opportunities and assistance with household expenses that had eliminated the financial pressures that had driven her to take food from the bakery. The case had been resolved without charges, and Mrs. Kim had eventually become one of the bakery's most loyal customers. The investigation had revealed how apparent criminal behavior could mask underlying social problems that required community-wide responses rather than individual punishment. Detective Park's work had strengthened social connections and had created support systems that had helped other families facing similar challenges. As Dr. Vasquez continued through the sub-basement archive, she observed how these earliest police records documented a form of law enforcement that had been deeply integrated with community life and social relationships. Officers had been expected to understand local dynamics and to work with residents to address problems before they escalated into serious conflicts or criminal activity. File 1951078 contained the investigation of a series of petty thefts at the downtown hardware store, where small tools and supplies had been disappearing over several weeks despite the owners' careful attention to inventory and security procedures. The losses had not been substantial enough to threaten the business, but they had been consistent enough to suggest systematic theft rather than customer error or employee oversight. Detective Robert Martinez had investigated the hardware store thefts through careful observation and analysis of store routines, eventually identifying a pattern that suggested the perpetrator was familiar with the store's layout and operations. His investigation had focused on individuals who had regular access to the store during business hours and who might have knowledge of where valuable items were kept. The detective's work had revealed that the thefts were being committed by 15-year-old David Thompson, whose father worked as a carpenter and who had been taking tools to sell so that he could contribute to his family's household expenses during a period when construction work had been scarce and money had been tight. Detective Martinez's report documented how the case had been resolved through cooperation between David's parents, the store owner, and community members who had provided temporary employment opportunities for the teenager that had allowed him to earn money legitimately while learning valuable work skills. The store owner had agreed not to press charges in exchange for restitution and community service. The investigation had revealed how economic pressures could drive young people to criminal behavior and had led to the development of informal apprenticeship programs that had provided legitimate opportunities for teenagers to learn trades while contributing to their family's financial stability. Dr. Vasquez found herself deeply moved by the humanity and wisdom that characterized these forgotten police records. Each investigation had been approached with understanding that criminal behavior often reflected underlying social problems that required community-wide solutions rather than individual punishment. The officers who had conducted these investigations had served not just as law enforcers, but as social healers and community builders. The sub-basement archive preserved evidence of a time when police work had been understood as essential community service that addressed the full spectrum of human needs and social relationships. These investigations had created stronger communities by addressing problems at their source and by building connections between residents who might otherwise have remained isolated from each other. As evening shadows began to gather in the forgotten chamber, Dr. Vasquez prepared to complete her initial survey of the sub-basement archive and to begin the process of cataloging and preserving these earliest police records. The cases she had discovered would need to be carefully processed and integrated into the main archival system, ensuring that their wisdom and humanity would remain available to guide future generations of law enforcement professionals. The sub-basement settled into its evening quiet as Dr. Vasquez ascended the narrow staircase, leaving the forgotten files to continue their patient vigil in the darkness below. The cases would remain where they had rested for decades, waiting for researchers and historians who might appreciate their evidence of how communities could address criminal problems through compassion, cooperation, and commitment to addressing underlying social needs. The deepest archive held its secrets close, preserving memories of investigations that had strengthened rather than divided communities and had created precedents for understanding police work as essential social service rather than simply law enforcement. These cases had found their rest in the quiet chamber where even memories of memories came to dwell, where silence held its deepest secrets and where the wisdom of the past waited patiently to inspire future generations. In the absolute stillness of the sub-basement, the earliest police records maintained their vigil over half-forgotten wisdom about community, compassion, and the patient work of building social connections that could prevent criminal behavior while healing the wounds that it left behind. The cases rested in perfect peace, their lessons preserved for those who might one day understand that the highest purpose of police work had always been not just to enforce laws, but to nurture the social relationships that made laws unnecessary. The silence deepened around the wooden filing cabinets, embracing records that had documented how human beings could live together peacefully when they understood their mutual dependence and shared responsibility for community welfare. The cases had completed their journey from active investigation to forgotten archive to rediscovered wisdom, finding their final rest in the place where silence held its deepest secrets and where the gentlest truths waited to be remembered.